Thank you very much for joining us today in our DC office and also online on Zoom for this event on revamping the pharmaceutical supply chain, implementing policy to prevent drug shortages. I'm Stephen Colville, Assistant Research Director with the Duke-Margolis Institute for Health. We're honored to host this event today on the incredibly pressing issue of drug shortages and honored that you're spending your time with us this afternoon. Before we get into our robust discussions, need to start with some brief housekeeping items. First, our statement of independence. The Duke-Margolis Institute for Health Policy is part of Duke University, and as such, we honor the tradition of academic independence on behalf of its faculty and scholars. Neither Duke nor the Margolis Institute take partisan positions, but individual members are free to speak their minds and express their opinions on important issues. In our discussions today, recommendations that have been published by the Duke-Margolis Institute ReVAMP Drug Supply Chain Consortium will be discussed. These recommendations are informed by our work with consortium members, but do not necessarily represent the views of every individual consortium member, and they're not intended to limit the ability of consortium members to provide their own comments on behalf of their independent organizations. For those here in person, please be mindful this is a working office, so you need to step out to take a call. It's totally fine if you could just ask our front desk staff. They'll make sure you get to the best place to take those. I would also, if you're going to talk to the front desk, I would normally tell you to ask Eric for his joke of the day. He's our normal front desk person, but unfortunately he's on vacation, so you can surprise the current front desk staff there with that question instead, and maybe they'll give you a chuckle. We miss you, Eric, for today. So we'll see you tomorrow. For our online attendees, you're welcome to submit questions through the Zoom Q&A. We don't have a lot of time for audience questions, but we'll weave them in where we can. And also they're important to inform our future work. We will be recording this meeting and posting the recording on our website for future reference. And lastly, for our in-person attendees, we'll have a reception in the lobby starting at 5 p.m. right after we wrap our last panel. So hopefully you can stick around. Now, without further ado, I'll go to our Institute Director, Mark McClellan, for some opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mark McClellan, Director of the Duke-Margolis Institute for Health Policy. I'd like to add my welcome and thanks to all of you for joining us in person and virtually for today's meeting on revamping the pharmaceutical supply chain, implementing policy to prevent drug shortages. This event is hosted by the Duke-Margolis ReVAMP Drug Supply Chain Consortium, which was founded early last year and consists of a range of stakeholders from across the pharmaceutical supply chain. Through the consortium, we're working together to generate effective policy solutions that promote a reliable and efficient drug supply chain with the ultimate goal of improving patient outcomes by reducing the frequency and severity of drug shortages. At the consortium, we have 4 tenets that form the foundation of our work and proposed solutions, as well as our ReVAMP moniker. We're seeking to promote a pharmaceutical supply chain that provides a reliable drug supply, reducing the frequency and severity of drug shortages, values consistent availability of quality medicines, uses advanced manufacturing technologies where appropriate to achieve those aims, and is patient-centered, aiming to deliver better, more reliable access and care for patients. We're here today because some significant and well-considered policy changes are needed to realize the vision of a more reliable supply chain for essential medicines. Drug shortages have persisted for several decades now in the United States. And unfortunately, last month, the number of drugs in shortage again hit an all-time high, with over 320 drugs in shortage, according to the drug shortage list maintained by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. The effects of these shortages are serious and far-reaching. They're associated with higher mortality risk, more medication complications and errors, delays in life-saving treatments for cancer care and other critical conditions, and significant financial consequences for our entire health system. Supply chain disruptions, including manufacturing quality issues, natural disasters, manufacturer market exits and product discontinuations, spikes in demand, and other threats, they happen, but they are too frequently causing impacts on patient care rather than being prevented through proactive steps or being adequately mitigated to reduce patient impact. Of the various types of disruptions, manufacturing quality issues are the leading driver of drug shortages, and they mostly affect generic drugs that have been on the market for a long time and have very low per unit prices. For example, failure to comply with manufacturing quality standards during production can cause issues in sterility or other critical product attributes that can lead to batches being scrapped by the manufacturer rather than being released on the market, potentially leading to a shortfall in supply. Or, in some cases, regulatory inspections may reveal issues with a manufacturer meeting current good manufacturing practices, causing a facility to shut down temporarily to fix the issue, or even permanently. Again, these things can lead to supply shortfalls. These quality issues are particularly concentrated in sterile injectable products, since they have to be carefully manufactured to meet a high standard to be administered safely by injection. And according to the U.S. Pharmacopoeia's 2023 Annual Drug Shortages Report released just last week, over half of sterile injectables in shortage cost less than $5. In large part, misaligned economic incentives and supports are the root cause of manufacturing quality issues and other challenges. Payments to hospitals and health systems aim to enable quality care, but also to encourage lower costs. And this works in many ways in our health systems. But for generic injectable drugs that are often in shortage, it's not working. Lacking insights into manufacturer reliability and under pressure to keep costs down, healthcare institutions often choose their generic suppliers based on lowest price at the moment. Manufacturers then compete by offering the lowest possible price at that point in time, and resulting low margins, unpredictable demand, discourage investments in the quality manufacturing and supply chain reliability measures that I've just discussed, which are needed to ensure a reliable supply chain over time. The challenge to patient access for these older, already low-priced drugs is availability, not just affordability. The drugs chronically in shortage generally meet FDA quality standards when they are accessible, when they're released on the market. They're just not consistently accessible. So a shift is needed, especially in the context of generic sterile injectable drugs, towards placing more value on and intentionality on reliable availability. For critical medications that patients depend on, reliability over time is just as important as quality at a point in time. Hospitals have good information and expectations, so they don't buy IV bags or tubes that have a risk of leaking after a few hours, or cardiac implants that aren't reliable over time. Purchasing decisions for critical generic drugs should meet the same expectation of reliability, of consistent quality over time. Now, to address these issues, the Duke-Margolis ReVAMP Consortium has organized our work across 4 work streams. Work stream 1 is supporting a coordinated and sustained federal effort. Work stream 2 is on proposing measurement and tracking mechanisms for supply chain reliability. Work stream 3 is exploring approaches to improve drug supply chain reliability. And work stream 4 is focusing on increasing adoption of advanced manufacturing technologies. In consultation with our consortium members, many of whom will be joining you this afternoon, we've already released a major publication from each of these 4 work streams. You can use the QR codes and the slides that I'm about to show to get access to these full publications. They're also on our website. I'll briefly highlight a few of our key recommendations and some of the policy progress we've seen so far or are hoping to see to provide some context for our time together today. First, the authorities and expertise needed to tackle this problem are varied and distributed across our federal agencies and the healthcare sector. To name a few agencies, FDA regulates manufacturers but has limited authorities related to the economic or market aspects of contracting that I described. ASPR works to ensure a secure and reliable supply of medicines, but is focused primarily on those needed for emergency response. CMS administers reimbursement policies that can influence provider behavior and choices and supports for quality care, including drug purchasing, but has limited direct authority related to manufacturing. And the Department of Defense, the Veterans Administration, the Department of Commerce, many other federal agencies also have an interest in supporting a secure and reliable supply of essential medicines. In our first white paper published last summer, we proposed the establishment of a cross-cutting initiative tasked specifically with preventing drug shortages and bringing together the relevant agencies to pursue comprehensive policy action. And we've been pleased to see the announcement last year and the launch this year of the HHS Supply Chain and Resilience and Shortage Coordinator's Office, along with a notable White House commitment to pulling together a coordinated response to these challenges. We'll hear more about these activities shortly from our next speaker in our first panel. The second area in which we've made major recommendations is in assessing and measuring supply chain reliability, not only to guide policy, but to help healthcare stakeholders work together to address the gaps that contribute to drug shortages. As I noted, providers and healthcare institutions contracting for and purchasing drugs often lack insights into the reliability of the different manufacturers they have to choose from. In an issue brief we published last year, we recommended the establishment of a drug supply chain reliability program aimed at assessing the relative reliability of generic drug supply chains, provided needed transparency for purchasing decisions to support quality, reliable drug access. This program's purpose would be to help high-performing manufacturers that are investing in their supply chain infrastructure to be more successful in the market. We also recommended the advancement of FDA's Quality Manufacturing Maturity Program, which aims to assess the sophistication of manufacturers' quality management practices. We suggested that this QMM program focus initially on a subset of essential multi-source generic drugs at high risk of shortage, where the program could have the most impact quickest. While QMM is designed to assess quality management practices at individual manufacturing facilities, there's also a need for more holistic assessments of reliability across the whole supply chain for a product. A program focused on reliability should also take into account other key contributors, such as redundancies in the supply chain, risk management plans, and manufacturing capacity. An HHS white paper published earlier this year proposed a manufacturer resilience assessment program that shared many common features with our proposal, and we'll talk more about these issues in our second panel today. Our third focus area is establishing incentives and financial alignment for more reliable manufacturing. Especially as tools and metrics develop to assess reliability, we want to ensure that there are supports for manufacturers to sustain real improvements in reliability and for providers to buy from manufacturers that demonstrate reliability. It's a critical part of quality drug manufacturing and supply. We've been particularly focused on the so-called demand side policies here. So I've said payment policies have encouraged payment arrangements with group purchasers and manufacturers that have put an emphasis on getting the lowest price at any given point in time. For real quality and continuing access to needed drugs, we want to revamp these payment arrangements to encourage and support the efficient production and supply of reliable drugs. While supply chain incentives can help new manufacturers enter the market and encourage new investments, these demand-side reforms are needed to ensure that there is a robust and efficient market for drugs that are available reliably and consistently. In a Health Affairs article published in January, we recommended Medicare implement an incentive payment program to enable providers to purchase essential generic medicines through committed contracts from reliable suppliers. Since then, there have been other proposals with similar approaches. The HHS white paper from April on preventing drug shortages proposes a hospital resilient supply program that would implement CMS incentives for hospitals based on their purchasing practices and outcomes related to drug shortages, or maybe more accurately, avoiding drug shortages. The Senate Finance Committee's draft Drug Shortage Prevention and Mitigation Act, released in May, would create a Medicare incentive program to reward providers who purchase drugs through committed contracts with more certainty of demand and more transparency on the reliability of suppliers. We submitted comments on that draft legislation just last week. Our recommendations included streamlining reporting for participating providers, wholesalers, and group purchasing organizations in order to minimize administrative burden, strengthening core standards for participation, and further encouraging participation in drug supply chain reliability initiatives through agreements with participating manufacturers and their customers, all to help assure that reliable access to drugs is achieved more effectively. We're looking forward to discussing proposals in this important area and other considerations in our third session today. Our consortium's fourth and final area of focus has been increasing the adoption of advanced manufacturing technologies. As I'm sure many of you know, advanced manufacturing has the potential to increase the total capacity to allow for greater flexibility and quicker response, to reduce the physical and environmental footprint of pharmaceutical manufacturing. These these manufacturing reforms can also increase quality assurance, helping to prevent the types of quality issues that often contribute to drug shortages. Despite that potential, the vast majority of drug manufacturing still uses traditional methods and technologies. Adoption of advanced manufacturing technologies has been particularly slow in generic manufacturing, in large part due to the significant upfront costs of equipment upgrades and the kinds of uncertainty about contracting that I've talked about in my remarks today. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 created 2 new FDA programs designed to increase the adoption of advanced manufacturing: the Centers of Excellence in Advanced and Continuous Manufacturing and the Advanced Manufacturing Technologies Designation Program. In an issue brief we published a few months ago, we put forth a series of considerations to increase the reach and impact of both of these programs. Among other points, we recommended that the Centers of Excellence allow for specialization in different product and technology types, and that they prioritize generic manufacturer participation. We also suggested the designation program utilize a more holistic definition of advanced manufacturing technologies, taking into account the state of the field as a whole and the potential impact of improvements rather than focusing primarily on the novelty, the newness of the technology in question. In our final session today, we'll ask our panelists to share more on the benefits of advanced manufacturing, the challenges to its adoption, what more industry, FDA, and others can do to support effective adoption and address these drug supply issues. Now, we're looking forward to all of our speakers in the upcoming sessions sharing their perspectives on these important issues and discussing next steps, practical steps, path forward. And as we reflect on all the work that's been done in recent years, I want to take a brief moment to thank our consortium members. As you can see from the member list here, we're pleased to have representation from a diverse group of stakeholders all across the different healthcare sectors that determine the performance of our drug supply chain. We deeply appreciate your collaboration, your engagement on these important issues, and the expertise and insights you continue to share. If you're interested in learning more or participating in our consortium efforts, please feel free to check out our consortium website or email us. Or if you're there at the event, if you're here with us in person, just ask any of our team members. And a final thanks in advance to all of our speakers and all of you for spending time with us today and for your ongoing efforts to address critical drug shortages. Now, I'd like to introduce Kristen Link-Young, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council for Health and Veterans Affairs, who will share some opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks to Mark for that introduction from afar. I will keep this relatively brief so that we have plenty of time for questions. But I'm Kristen. I lead the health policy team at the White House, and I want to talk about 3 things today. First, how we at the White House see the drug shortages problem. Second, how we see solutions. And third, why I'm optimistic about this moment in time and our ability to make progress on solving these challenges. As this room absolutely knows, drug shortages are not a new problem, but they are an urgent problem that continues to build in intensity and, like so many other supply chain challenges, was really laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the most basic level, we have a problem that arises from the fact that in a fragmented healthcare system,
actors are not rewarded for caring about the resiliency of generic drug supply. And as a result, they don't. Purchasers of drugs, for the most part, prioritize only price. And so we get a generic drug supply that is fractions of a penny cheaper, but a lot less resilient than we could otherwise have. And this fundamental market failure is exacerbated by the market power of a small number of firms that aggregate purchasing power. Those firms, those middlemen in this market are responding to the incentives of the ultimate purchasers, but as they have concentrated their market power, they have become incredibly efficient in channeling those incentives, which at this time largely focus on lowering the price of generic drugs. And so this plays out in multiple ways. It's a market that doesn't consider quality of the manufacturers that are producing drugs. As Mark discussed, a majority of drug shortages arise from quality issues at a manufacturing facility. And manufacturers are simply not rewarded when they make the necessary but sometimes costly investments in quality improvement and a culture of quality within their facility. The lack of reward for those kinds of investments creates a race to the bottom where no manufacturer is adequately able to sustain the investments in quality that we all believe are necessary in this market. I think you also see it playing out in a particularly strange way, even at the price point that we are at for our generic prescription drugs. We get to that price point through a series of contracting mechanisms that seem uniquely suited to create a lack of resiliency. So we have contracts that are extremely short term, that have a complete lack of predictability, and create major cliffs for manufacturers and a total inability to plan. And so it is striking that even at the price point we are at, we have gotten to that price point through a series of contracting mechanisms that are particularly ill-suited for our resiliency goals as a country. You also see a concentration of supply, and you see this at all levels of the pharmaceutical supply chain, from key starting materials to APIs to finished dosage forms. No one is rewarded for caring about diverse supply, and so we see that concentration and that race to the bottom in fewer and fewer manufacturers, and concentration that accelerates as you move from end products towards starting materials. And there's a lack of transparency into those supply chains because no one cares about rewarding diversity and incentivizing resiliency of the supply chain. There's very limited transparency into what those supply chains look like, and that lack of transparency is embedded through a series of choices by foreign governments that can really contribute to an absence of resiliency in this market. We also see it playing out in the form of limited buffer and limited excess in all sorts of ways throughout our supply chain. So there is no excess manufacturing capacity. There is no machine downtime. There is no flexibility in many cases to respond and increase production when there are disruptions in supply or increases in demand. There's no inventory sitting on shelves anywhere in the system, and there is no individual level buffer stock held by hospitals and other purchasers of generic drugs. And so we really have a lack of flexibility and resiliency, not just in the big ways where things are made, but also in the small ways where we purchase and store these products. And so those are a series of challenges, but again, they all result from this fundamental market failure that we do not adequately reward resiliency, and we do not create incentives for our purchasers to care about the resiliency of the prescription drug supply. So that brings us to solutions. What do we do from here? We need to reward resiliency in all of its forms. So as policymakers, we need to find opportunities to create incentives for people to care about resiliency, reward them when they do, and penalize them when they don't. The US government doesn't do much in the way of purchasing drugs directly. We have some levers, and we are thinking about those levers. But of course, most of our power comes in the enormous amount of influence and leverage we have over the healthcare system as a whole, and healthcare providers more broadly. And so, from my seat, I don't think that there is a silver bullet in this space. There is no single policy that will magically make all of our purchasers care about resiliency and restructure this market. But there are a lot of small ways where we can push the market to care more about resiliency and appropriately incentivize those efforts. So as you all know, and we'll hear more about today, CMS has proposed a rule recently to take a very small step of rewarding small hospitals when they keep buffer stock of generic drugs on their shelves. This is a small incremental step that is not going to transform the market, but it is sending a signal about the way that we think hospitals should be behaving when it comes to purchasing drugs. And it is backing that with federal dollars that are available when small hospitals make those choices. CMS has also said that it intends to propose new conditions of participation related to pharmaceutical supply, which could send a more general and powerful signal about the importance of caring about the resiliency of supply in obtaining pharmaceuticals for the entire hospital industry. We think about our industrial-based investments as a federal government and the way we can use our industrial-based dollars to align with quality and resiliency goals. You can't solve all the problems that way, but they offer an important opportunity to complement private investment and to build a more resilient supply here at home. We also think a lot about the development of the tools that purchasers need in order to reward resiliency. We need to create more transparency about where drugs are coming from and about the quality decisions that are being made by manufacturers. And so you'll hear from FDA today about the quality management maturity framework that will we think be an important step on this journey to being able to, if we want to tell hospitals that they should care about quality of the purchase decision, they need a way to do that. And we think this is an important new tool that enables us to really hold people accountable for those purchasing decisions. And of course, we also think there is, critical importance in legislative solutions to more holistically reward hospitals and other purchasers for caring about the resiliency of supply. And so both the Department of Health and Human Services and the Senate Finance Committee have released pretty comprehensive proposals to attach meaningful new federal dollars to decisions to purchase drugs in resilient ways. Again, none of those policies are built from one single policy, but they are one single set of incentives, but they are built from a set of dollars that flow based on incremental choices to care about resiliency in supply and purchasing decisions. So I want to close with a little reflection on why I am optimistic about the moment in time we find ourselves at on this issue and the journey that we have been on with respect to generic drug shortages. First, I see a huge amount of concurrence about the nature of the problem. I think the cancer drug shortages that we saw about 18 months ago were really a galvanizing moment. And even in the last 18 months, you have seen increased understanding from all players about the nature of this problem and the market failure that we face. You see policymakers and industry and academics and the broader purchasing community having the same sort of conversation about what is needed and how the market has broken down. That's not true in a lot of policy spaces, and I think it is a tremendous sign of the opportunity that we have and the way in which the moment is ripe here to make progress on these issues. Second, I am very encouraged by what we are seeing from the private sector in terms of their own investment in the general direction of travel that we need to be going in. And so you see all of the major group purchasing organizations creating pilot programs to enable their clients to make decisions to purchase in more resilient ways. You see new entrants in the manufacturing and the purchasing market that are trying to disrupt the way drugs have been purchased in the past and put a greater premium on resiliency in these markets. To be clear, those private sector investments or pilot programs or however you want to describe them, they will not solve the problem on their own, but they do indicate private sector alignment on the direction of travel. And they create a situation where we are not scaling a steel wall in trying to get the market to respond, but rather we have innovations and we have steps from the private sector that enable response and that the policymakers can really build on and continue to drive forward. And finally, I take a great amount of optimism from the bipartisan nature of this problem. This is a market and a market failure where you do not see partisan fragmentation. You see a huge amount of bipartisan alignment on the Hill, on the nature of the problem, as well as in the broader stakeholder and policymaking community about what we need to do and how we can tackle these problems. And so I think those are critical fundamentals to getting something done and continuing to make progress on these issues and driving forward in a way that is important into the future. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and I think we're a small room, so just raise your hand.
Hi, everyone. I'm Todd Ebert from the Healthcare Group Purchasing Association, the GPOs. One of the things that we've seen just recently through HHS and the white paper, as well as the Senate Finance Committee drug shortage draft legislation, is the development of public-private working groups to address some of the key issues that are yet to be defined, especially in the legislation or the white paper. How does the White House, how do you envision what those working groups would look like, and what type of decisions do you see them tackling?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, which for those on the screen was about what we see coming in terms of the development of public-private partnerships. I think all of the policymakers in the space that are trying to drive change and are trying to drive markets that better reward resiliency recognize that the market needs to evolve, and it needs to evolve in ways that are somewhat unpredictable. There is not a silver bullet. There's not one single thing we need to do. We need to make a set of changes that reward resiliency, and we need to build on those over time. And so this is not a situation where we can decide what needs to be done in an ivory tower or one of the brutalist buildings down the street. Instead, we need to engage in an iterative way with industry and continue to build for the future. And so I think you see that basic premise reflected in a lot of the work. I will say in the context of the HHS proposal specifically, HHS is really interested in building durable ways to measure facility level quality investments, and creating that facility level information about which facilities are producing high quality, are producing medications in ways that are consistent with quality and resiliency goals. And to do that, we can either build an army of federal surveyors, which we are unlikely to do, or we can engage in public-private partnership so that the federal government can set some basic standards about what we are looking for, and we can leverage the private sector to really support that facility level monitoring, a lot like we see in other sorts of accreditation models. And so, I think HHS is very interested in ways to build out that type of partnership and measure that facility level resilience in a way that is durable and that meets the moment in terms of political feasibility.
Then perhaps a follow-up question. Michaela Messinaro, the head of policy at the White House. A question regarding the distribution and the location of the supply chain to do this. Because if you want to verify these things, you need to see them somehow. Do you see any particular role of location specifically, given that these supply chains are very distributed, mostly international, in terms of what then will translate into incentives or not coming through these programs?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The question was about the sort of location of our supply chain and how we think about that. Location is absolutely critical. We have an increasing challenge with dominance of the PRC in our pharmaceutical supply chain, particularly for KSMs and APIs, but we face a challenge even in finished dosage forms in the concentration in China of our capacity to produce medication. This is a challenge that the U.S. government cannot solve by itself, and so we are thinking about opportunities to friendshore and nearshore and incentivize investment in non-PRC based channels of producing KSMs and APIs. And I think there is a lot of really exciting work going on across the world on this topic. You see Japan investing in some Japanese based manufacturing. You see the EU coordinating its own investments across the board. As the US, we have been doing our own industrial base work. And so, I think there is a critical need for coordination across the world governments in diversifying the supply and ensuring that we get out of the situation we are in, where most KSMs are really based in only one place, and we have no other alternatives as a country or as manufacturers.
Thank you.
Stephen Stalker with McKesson. Just going back to your comments around your optimism that something will materialize here. Can you also frame it in the context of all the other healthcare issues, the cybersecurity, obviously the big issue recently? Where does drug shortages fit in that kind of universe and your confidence that something can be moved forward?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and there is a lot of healthcare policy that needs to get done in the relatively near term, and it is not just drug shortages. One of the things that I think makes drug shortages a relatively more easy problem to solve is that we are not talking about a lot of money. A lot of things in healthcare involve a lot of money, and the sort of scale of dollars that we are talking about here is relatively narrow. And so, I think that makes it easier to envision policy riding on, various legislative policy riding on various healthcare legislative vehicles, whether this year or next. But we are not talking about many tens of billions of dollars. We are talking about, much smaller numbers. And we are talking about incremental solutions that move the ball a little bit down the field and offer opportunities to iterate and continue to improve together. And I think, in these broader legislative policy conversations, it is not that one single thing gets done, right? There are constellations of issues that get attacked together. And so I think, there is a big list, but this conversation is very much a part of the priority setting. And again, the sort of concurrence around the nature of the problem, the alignment and the types of solutions we are pursuing create, pretty good fundamentals for legislative change to complement all of the work that's going on inside the federal government now. Okay, I think I am just about at time, so thank you so much. Pleasure to be here, and I hope you all continue to have a really engaging discussion throughout the day. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Hamilton Lopez. I'm the Senior Research Director of Biomedical Innovation here at Duke-Margolis. I'd like to call up our first panel, please. All right. Well, I first want to thank Kristen. That was an excellent way to get us started. So, and also just a quick thanks to all our panelists. We are excited for kind of kicking us off on today's discussion. So, as we've been working on drug shortages at the Institute over the last few years, we've been heartened to see an evolving understanding of the root causes of drug shortages. And also, as Kristen just mentioned, a more holistic approach to some of the policy responses. So what we are going to do today is hear from some of the leaders who are involved in these policy responses at a federal level. We're going to hear from Jacqueline Corrigan-Karai, Principal Deputy Center Director of FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Rebecca Halfaji, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. Arlene Joyner, Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of the Office of Industrial-Based Management and Supply Chain at ASPR. And then Meena Seshumani, Deputy Administrator and Director at the Center for Medicare within CMS, who will be here soon. Okay. So as Mark mentioned in his opening comments, drug shortages has been a long-standing issue, and we are going to need a collaborative approach with federal agencies and the private sector, something that we can create a long-lasting solution to prevent future drug shortages. So that's why it's the first of our 4 work groups within ReVAMP, and as we made it our first session here today, really focused on supporting a sustained and coordinated approach to tackle this problem. So I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to give a few brief comments about their involvement in this area. But Jacqueline, can we start with you, please?
Sure, and I'd just like to set the stage a little bit about drug shortages and numbers and how we think about it. So the FDA defines a drug shortage as a national demand exceeding supply, and that's a little bit different. You heard about 300 drug shortages from HSP. They define a shortage as a pharmacy, a short supply issue that affects how a pharmacy supplies. So one manufacturer could have a supply issue, but there's still adequate supply on a national level, in which case we wouldn't declare a shortage. So when you look at our shortage page, you'll see about 100 shortages right now, maybe a little bit more. Now, for shortages, since 2012, manufacturers have been coming in and they have to report to us. They have to tell us there's either a discontinuation or there's a supply disruption in the drug or the API that could lead to a shortage. And that's been incredibly effective for us to exercise the tools that we have as a regulatory agency. For example, there was about 251 shortages in 2011. Last year in 2023, we just reported to Congress on 55 shortages in a year. And that, on average, it's about in the 40s. This was an unusual year. Actually, the Center for Biologics had about 20 shortages. They usually have 1 or 2. It was an issue with single manufacturer and a number. We outlined some of the causes in the report. And that, that's good news that it's not at 251. It doesn't mean it, but as I told you, there's 100 shortages, right? So, shortages take a while to resolve depending upon the time and what causes them. I mean, when we looked at about 100 shortages that we resolved in the past year, the average time to resolution was about 20 months, which is a long time. It's close to 2 years. That means some, though, resolve in a month, some don't resolve for years. But most are going to take at least 5 months to resolve, and that has a potential impact on patients. We talked a little bit, I think you heard, about why do drugs go in shortage. Now, Mark highlighted the issues of quality and manufacturing, and it's not about the drugs, it's about the resilience of the manufacturing and not having breakdowns in the quality. And actually, in 2019, that was the predominant issue, and then demand was about 20 to 30%, and API has been less than 10%. However, COVID changed that. Demand has increased and has continued. So in 2023, over 50% of our shortages were driven by demand. Now, some of that, about the GLP-1s and the demand for those are in that bucket. And so quality and manufacturing dropped to about 1/3. API ticked up a little bit, and that's because a lot of our the manufacturers for some of the ADHD drugs, attention deficit disorder, talked about API issues, and that's a complicated situation with any controlled substances. And so we also talked about global and, is this because all our manufacturing is not in the US? All our manufacturing is not in the US, but it is a really global supply chain. If you look just at generics in 23, about the same number of API facilities are in the US as they are in China, and India is a little bit more. Now, that doesn't mean for every drug, because the supply chain can be different. The US was dominating in terms of registered facilities, again, for generics in the US. Finished dosage form, China was less, and then India is in there as well. But we are right there, when you get farther back and you start looking at KSMs, and we know there's reliance in India from China. But it is a global market, and it's not just where a facility is that determines what happens. What we can do when there's a shortage is we can expedite regulatory decisions, get new plants online, get new suppliers. We can publish information if the manufacturer has it to extend the shelf life. And we can work with other manufacturers, which we do. And so, we wouldn't be successful. We not only, there are 50 shortages, but we prevented over 240 last year. And that's because manufacturers are willing to work with us and help us get supply where it's needed, although sometimes we just are not successful. And if we can't get a critical drug, we can look abroad. We can look for a drug that's not approved, and we do a very thorough assessment of that drug. And there's a Dear Healthcare Provider letter if we're going to import that drug about any differences. And that was done, it was mentioned, the oncology shortages, we did that. Now, we are, as we said, we're the regulatory agency, and you've heard a lot about the economics. You've heard about same thing we found in 2019 about the price of these drugs that tend to go into shortage. So our role here is, as you heard, we can issue guidance on risk management plans, trying to get facilities to be more proactive in thinking about the risks that could happen. We are working on the quality management protocol assessment framework. We're going out, and so this can be another tool that could be used. And then we do have quite a program, a robust program in advanced manufacturing. We meet early with any company that's interested in advanced manufacturing. We're working on a regulatory framework that can accommodate all sorts of advanced manufacturing and of course, but of course, again, we can only be there to help on the regulatory, the sort of financial incentives needed to sort of take that plunge are not there. So I think, we're sort of the emergency room of shortages, right? By the time you get to us, that's where you are. And I think what we're, happy to see is a lot more focus on how do we move up the sort of chain and prevent them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Rebecca?
Sure. Hi. These are on. Yes. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Hapchi. As noted, I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary within ASPE. So I've been with the administration for about a little over 3 years, and I'm a lawyer and health services, health policy researcher by training. ASPE, which is an agency that is near and dear to my heart and I love, is the principal advisor to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services on policy development. And so we are responsible for major activities across the department around policy coordination, evaluation, economic analyses, strategic planning, legislative development, legislation development, and other policy research. So I like to think of us as sort of like the think tank within HHS. We have done a lot of work relevant to supply chain over the years, really focusing on it at least since 2011, but working on prescription drug markets and well before that. And so we have an established history of policy research on medical product development, shortages, and supply chain resiliency as well. We also spearhead coordination strategies across the department. One example might be the National Action Plan for Combating Antibiotic Resistant Bacteria, or the CARB plan you may have heard of. So we do these sorts of things in ASPE. When in November 2023, the White House issued this fact sheet that many of you may be aware of as to supply chain steps to mitigate supply chain shortages and strengthen resilience. There's a designation of HHS, an HHS Supply Chain Resilience and Shortage Coordinator. And the idea behind this was, again, to strengthen the resilience of medical products and address related shortages. And so the Secretary of HHS designated ASPE to take on that role of coordinator, and we're really being critical to working across government and within HHS and enhancing coordination to increase access to essential medical products and reduce shortages. The coordinator, so that's one of our main functions now in this domain. We do facilitate cross-department activities and work with partners both within and outside of government. Again, the coordinator's role is not to duplicate any of the work or roles that were going on before. It's sort of to supplement. And I think really what I've seen it is bring things together and enhance coordination, because some of that and those conversations weren't always happening before. It was somewhat siloed. And so I think it's been a really great development, actually. And ASPR and FDA serve as two of the three co-chairs of the council that works with the coordinator, and ASPE being the third. So there's a lot of close collaboration going on. We are working on things like establishing this cross-HHS supply chain resilience and shortage working group committee. That's what I just mentioned, co-chaired by ASPR and FDA. We are working on gathering input from stakeholders and other sources. We are still in the development stages, but working actively on an action plan, a strategic plan around reducing shortages. And then, of course, ASPE helped lead in the development and coordination of this HHS white paper that everybody is mentioning and referencing. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what we've been working on in this space and what our role is within HHS.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Arlene?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and share.
Again, I'm Arlene Joyner. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Industrial Based Management and Supply Chain Group, IBMSC. We are a relatively new office or center within ASPR. We were created out of COVID when there was a realization that there were many supply chain issues that HHS really had not dealt with in the past, definitely not at a national scale. And a lot of them are actually commodity commercial type items like PPE, testing and diagnostics. The group that ran all of the COVIDtest.gov program. Hopefully you guys all ordered your tests online and had them delivered to your front door. That came out of my office. So again, something that nobody else, had been dealing with previously. We also have an advanced manufacturing and technologies group, a supply chain optimization group, and then our DPA office for HHS also falls under my office. So 5 domains there. The most critical, I think, and relevant to our discussion today are the DPA office and then our advanced manufacturing and technologies. The advanced manufacturing and technologies group, and I will say all of the groups together spending COVID supplemental dollars. We've invested in 17 to 18 billion dollars. A lot of it was the purchasing of COVID tests, but the other half of that, I would say, is for or was for domestic manufacturing and capacity building. A lot for PPE, but also the advanced manufacturing technologies their focus is APIs and KSMs. So that is a big program for us. We've had limited dollars to start with, just because that wasn't initially recognized as an issue. But as COVID continued, it became a bigger issue, and it's definitely a big topic now. So as we receive funding, again, we were, I'll say, living off of COVID dollars. We did receive our first annual budget for 24, and as we go forward, we are requesting additional funds so that we can continue to grow our program with APIs and KSMs. We did have a study that we sponsored through the third party called ARMY. So this was a critical drugs essential medicines list. It was published in May of 2022. And that was a collaboration with the FDA as well as clinicians, doctors, pharmacies, and it did focus on the scenario of acute care within a hospital respiratory pandemic. So those stakeholders took an initial FDA list through the executive order, and I can't remember the number of that executive order, that they had to create in 2020. That was whittled down to 86 most critical drugs in the ARMY list, and that was published. So that's our focus going forward from an ASPR perspective. As Mark mentioned, our focus is on pandemic and a public health emergency response. So our lane is a little bit more narrow. So that study kind of gives us the guardrails on the products that we invest in. So our goal is to kind of tick through that whole list of those APIs and KSMs that impact those critical drugs as we, again, have investment funding and working on domestic manufacturing. So far, we've spent about $980 million since the middle of COVID, and are working on, I want to say, 14 different APIs and KSMs. So we're looking, again, hopefully over the years, as we receive funding, we will be knocking off that list and working on, again, our focus is domestic manufacturing and building that resilience. I will say we do have a lot of factors that actually Kristen mentioned. There's a lot of economic factors associated with that. Everyone knows the margins for generics are not huge. So there's a lot of issues there that we have to consider as we're making investments. We are looking at advanced manufacturing technologies, other ways that are not the same as the traditional that might make these processes more economically feasible and appealing to domestic manufacturers. So I'll stop there. I think we've got a few questions we're probably going to answer, so I'll stop at that point.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Oh, is it my turn now? I'm the late arrival.
We gave you some minutes to catch your breath.
Oh, it's fine. I'm apologies for being late. My other meeting ran over. I'm Mina Seishamani. I lead the Center for Medicare at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And it's really great to be here with all of you today. And in particular, be here with everyone on this panel because I'm sure, as you have already heard, I know from when I arrived, hearing Rebecca talk about how important having a coordinator is, because the issues of drug shortages and supply chain are manifold and don't all sit within one agency within HHS, number one. Number two, the issues that we are, that we know underlie issues with the supply chain, the concentration of the supply chain, lack of transparency, the market dynamics that are leading to lack of resiliency, especially in the generic space, don't necessarily all have current regulatory authorities associated in terms of levers, right? I oftentimes tell people when they say, I want Medicare to do X, I say, well, Medicare is really 3 different levels. You have Medicare law at the 50,000 foot level that gives us authorities. Then you have the regulations we put out, which is under the law, following the law, that's like at the 25,000 foot level. And then you have how things actually play out on the ground between the various players in the healthcare system. And I think that the supply chain and issues of drug shortages is a perfect example of that, where you have law, regulations, and how the market moves and makes decisions all playing a role in what has been a decades-long problem. And it's really wonderful to be in partnership with all of the people here and the teams that they represent as we think through this thorny issue, and to partner with all of you, again, because we can't do it all. It really does require a true partnership of everybody in this space as we think through what is possible and then take actions. I think from my perspective, obviously I lead the Medicare program. And as we think about the market dynamics, particularly with resiliency for, generics, where do we have current regulatory authorities where we can contribute to the solutions? And you may have seen in our recent inpatient prospective payment system. So this is the big payment regulation that we put out every year governing payments that we make to hospitals, that we have proposed a buffer stock policy where, for certain generic drugs that are on these shortages list, for small hospitals, less than 100 beds, that we will pay the the Medicare cost of maintaining a buffer supply so that it provides that resiliency for those small hospitals. Because we also know that the issues of drug shortages do not impact everyone in the same way. There's definitely disparities. And this is one of the pieces of feedback that we have gotten, comments that we have gotten. And so we have that proposal out now, and we will be evaluating comments as we finalize. Another area is in the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. There is a provision in the drug law for inflation rebates, whereby if certain drugs increase in price faster than inflation, the manufacturer has to pay that difference back to the Medicare program. And one of the provisions in the law was that that amount of rebate could be adjusted in the cases of shortage so that you're not actually exacerbating a shortage. So again, with feedback that we got from many people, for drugs that are on the shortage list, in particular, we are looking to waive inflation rebates for plasma-derived products and generics, because we know those are the areas that have that critical, fragile nature to the supply chain that we want to enable a little bit more play in the system to, get out of shortage. So we finalized in our guidance that we would decrease the inflation rebate by 75% in the first year on shortage, then 50% the second year, 25% on the third year. And we also finalized provisions around providing reduction of the inflation rebate in cases of severe supply chain disruption, and in cases for generics if there's a risk of shortage. And we currently have information collection requests out for comment for what is important data for us to collect from manufacturers so that we can assess if there is a severe supply chain shortage, disruption, if a generic has a risk of shortage, so that we can make sure that these policies are applied in the right ways so that we can navigate, discouraging runaway price increases while at the same time allowing movement where movement needs to happen to maintain resiliency in the market. So those are two examples of under our existing regulatory authorities of what we're doing in this space, but again, have been in partnership across the table, especially with the white paper that, that Rebecca mentioned, as we think ahead to what else could be possible.
Thank you so much for all of these opening comments. We've heard a lot about some really important next steps or efforts that are underway at the respective agencies. But, you know, what we are hearing also is that there is just an increasing cross HHS collaboration. So my question, which is multifold, and I'll start with you, Rebecca, and we can open it up to the panel, is can you describe how linking up across all of these different agencies can increase the potential and to optimize HHS's response to drug shortages? And kind of taking a question earlier from the audience, how could this linkage help ensure that drug shortages remains a policy topic when there's so many other things, so many other priorities that are ahead of us? And then my final part of that question is, you know, if we really are trying to do a cross HHS collaboration, what are some potential challenges to moving that forward, and what are some ideas for addressing those challenges?
Okay, I'll try to address all that.
I can't repeat it.
But so I think your first question was about this coordination piece and how can we really facilitate that in ways that we maybe weren't doing before. And so I think the coordinator, just in a little more detail on what we're doing and envisioning doing. One is having, so it's lots of meetings. I'll just start with that. So it's meeting a lot within this working group of leadership across HHS and with ASPR and FDA, the other key co-chairs of the working group, to make sure that there isn't redundancy in what anyone is doing. And we are really working together to make sure that all of the bases are covered and that we are coordinating with other departments, with the White House, to make sure that any information that is needed, that it, you know, from others, that we are providing that we have intel from other departments and other entities and with amongst ourselves as to what is going on, and can help as where appropriate, you know, where we'd have different authorities. I think coordinating analyses as well as something the department is doing of gaps in our existing roles and responsibilities and policy and regulations and funding. So what needs to be done that we aren't actually collectively doing, and what would we need to do that? So are there other authorities we need? Is it actually within our powers? Do we need money? Those sorts of things. Coordinating with external stakeholders, lots of meetings with external stakeholders to Mina's point, to figure out what's happening on the ground and how is this playing out? How can we get more information about these different stakeholders and markets so that we can make sure that we are understanding how this is happening? And within ASPE, you know, we're developing a research agenda, the coordinator is, but we actually carry out a lot of that research as well. And some things I'll tell you, we have good transparency around and understand, you know, reasonably well. There are things that we do not have the data yet, and we do not know. I think the middlemen and that part of the market is one example where we don't really well understand how that is influencing different market factors and price and those sorts of things. I think facilitating the sharing of some of these data as well, the shortage data and the supply chain data, and making sure that if one agency has it, that would be helpful elsewhere, that we are sharing of that data and using it optimally. Sometimes we have the data, but we're not actually doing some of the analyses that we are leveraging it in the ways that we could. So that's a lot of sort of what we're envisioning the coordinator do, you know, sort of topically, but then, you know, there's specific things like, you know, we developed the white paper, we are doing a research agenda, we are doing a strategic plan within HHS as to, you know, how we want to carry out in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years. So that's some of what we're envisioning around, you know, surveillance, data analytics, monitoring and implementation, facilitating partnerships, and then coordinating responses, I think are kind of the buckets of what we're doing. I will say to one of your other questions, the key challenge here is still the complexity and multiplicity of these issues, and that they cross so many thresholds. I mean, an example is the formula shortages that we came across, and there's just sometimes a limited amount that even within HHS we can do, and we need to be working closely with USDA and other partners. And so I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do with the coordination, is not allow those silos and those segmented sort of domains and jurisdiction to inhibit our ability to move out on an issue, because to just say, well, we don't have the data for that, but instead, who does? And like, how can we facilitate those linkages and act quickly? And also, I think importantly, not just be reactive, but be proactive. And so that's some of where we're turning to, is anticipating these shortages. And some of what we're thinking about in ASPE is, are there factors that we can identify as patterns as to what is driving these shortages, and how can we anticipate when they're going to happen better and use the data to do that, and develop more data. For one example we've just been thinking about is environmental disasters and hazards, and like how that's sort of a new frontier, but like, how have those affected shortages, and is there a way we could analytically be thinking about how we could predict that going forward, and then work with private sector to understand, does this factor into where you locate your plants, and or should it? So it's so multi-sectoral and multi-factored that it is very hard to coordinate all these components and make the whole system, everything work well together. So I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge. And then, I think you've seen in this administration a definite sense of prioritization of this topic, and making sure that the will is there, that we are doing very concrete things to advance things, and then trying to put as much money and asking for more money that we aren't always getting from Congress, but to do so. But it will take, sustained, I think it's bipartisan, and that's great, but it will take sustained interest from Congress and other stakeholders to really keep this moving forward and as a priority. It really does have to have money behind it too, and giving, I think, additional legislative authority, or from legislation, additional authorities to HHS as well.
Great, thanks. And Jacqueline, I think the same question, but do you see a linkage between all these agencies ultimately impacting when it finally does become an emergency room, and what the FDA is kind of facing? Are there ways that all the work that you're seeing in this collaboration could ultimately impact what's ahead of your agency?
Sure. Well, I think it's always, very helpful for us to be communicating on these issues. I mean, there's some things that are just very regulatory and we will take action, but I think, having an awareness and working on the bigger picture together is very important. And, to have knowledge, insights into other things that we may not be focusing on at the moment. So, for us, I think having a broader perspective on the problem, in addition to sort of responding to the regulatory actions that we need to take, is important.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that. I am actually the ASPR representative working as the co-chair with the coordinators. And I think it's been a great program to have us all in the room meeting many meetings, as you mentioned, but frequently, because as you know, we're government, and there's just a lot of things that we just don't know each other is doing. So to actually having a centralized place where we can at least through HHS, and we know there's a lot of other things happening in other agencies even, but to kind of get ourselves together and understand who's doing what, I think is really important. One of the things that we are putting together is an action plan on looking at the gaps, things that we know are not being addressed, and how are we going to address them. And we have to consider, it's important for ASPE to know that ASPR, my group, is working on domestic manufacturing. What kind of funding do we have? Who are we working with? How far along are we on addressing those 86 products on the list? So I think it's good for awareness for people to know that. We've been learning also, what are the specific data points that ASPE has or FDA has, so that they can help us with, is that important market research information that we need as we're making awards and contracts to different companies. So I think just sharing that information and that awareness has been immensely helpful. As we do this action plan, we're also looking at a lot of the other, I'll say, to-do lists that we have that have resulted from other executive orders or a national strategy or the 100-day report or the 1-year report. There's a lot of these things that come out from Congress that we end up doing reports for. And I will say we all get homework and assignments and things that we have to do. So it's nice to be able to pull that all together. And I have to give credit to the ASPE team because it's a lot to do that on, so that we're not duplicating those efforts, right? And we can see that we're already addressing some things, but maybe it's not to the extent we need to. So then we can analyze, do we need to do more? Are there other things we need to be working on? So I think it's been, kind of a good collaboration between the different groups. And then, as I mentioned, there's other things that I think we need to pull in at some point. For instance, we are working with Department of Commerce on an API KSM study, and it's a survey Commerce is sending out for IVMSC to the manufacturers and getting information that by the authorities that the Commerce has, these companies are compelled to answer. And they might be where their supply chains are with certain critical medicines, or do they have sole source raw materials or KSMs? Are those vulnerabilities that we should be looking at? So we're leveraging that work that we're doing, again, with the Commerce. So I think interagency, anything we can do to collaborate with each other, I think is best for the whole program.
Thank you. So you mentioned the white paper that everyone is talking about, so we're going to do that a little more. But, the white paper put forth the creation of the manufacturer resilience assessment program and the hospital resilient supply program. Can we just talk about how critical these programs are and what changes you really hope that they will help drive? And I'm happy to start with, if you'd like to, Rebecca, and then Mina.
Yeah, I'll try to be fairly brief, and maybe I'll let Mina talk about the HSRP more. So the idea behind this white paper, so it goes into some of what we're doing already, some of what Mina mentioned already with our administrative authorities, what we would think could really help not fully solve the market failures we see here, but would be a big steps forward. And then also just mentions that, by the way, we have actually a lot of legislative proposals out there that would give us additional authorities. It doesn't go into super detail, I think, in the appendix, but it does. But that would actually supplement this thing, that things that we can't do right now with our administrative authorities, and that we would really be helpful to be able to do. But as to the proposals for what we could do right now, but we need money to do so, is sort of two components. One is called the MRAP, which is the Manufacturer Resiliency Assessment Program. And so that's a little more in the vein of what FDA is in their jurisdiction, but goes beyond that. So the idea behind this is we would create a non-governmental national accreditation body, or we would help in the development of that. So this is the public-private partnership piece, and they would conduct some core activities and work closely with HHS. They would conduct manufacturer assessments to assign scores or metrics that are based on manufacturer management practices and other resilience activities. So how resilient and quality is your manufacturing? Then we would try to be meeting the requirements for accreditation, and then also be sharing information about these manufacturer scores to this other component, which is the hospital piece. So the idea here is to sort of make a metric and assessment of, like, for a given manufacturer, how resilient, what are you undertaking that is going to make sure you are going to have a resilient supply that is of good quality, that you don't have vulnerabilities and future shortages. And then that would be transparent, like that would be available to people would know about that. So, and particularly our hospital program. The second component is this, it's called the Hospital, I want to get the acronyms right, Hospital Resilient Supply Program, or HRSP. And this would use some new and some existing authorities to link the Medicare payments and or penalties to a hospital-based scorecard. So here, the scorecard would be at the hospital level. It would be a combination of something of attestations that the hospital makes, and also ratings that are developed by the HRSP that would reflect how the hospital is doing in achieving progress in adopting practices that promote supply chain resilience among them, middlemen, and manufacturers. So some examples might be, are you stockpiling and keeping buffer stocks? Are you engaging in contracting practices that promote long-term relationships and sustainability, like long-term contracts, minimum purchasing volume requirements, those sorts of things. Then based on what scorecard a hospital gets, we would provide, Medicare would provide incentive or penalty payments for possibly an initial smaller set of drugs, and then those could expand out as well and could be phased in. I think there's some key still unresolved things around, you know, making sure that incentive payment is at the right, or penalty is at the right amount. And, you know, and I think the bigger picture, and then I'll turn over Mina, but is this is using kind of what we mostly can do and some new things, but to drive through our Medicare program and making sure that hospitals are actually, you know, engaging with the quality the resilient manufacturers. So we're driving like through that demand, better practices at that level. And that's a way that we can do that, because we can't force manufacturers to have to produce certain drugs or in certain facilities and that sort of thing. But we can, through our Medicare program, drive some of this. So I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, you summarized it well. I think this is an example, coming back to what I spoke about in my opening remarks, of where you have Medicare, you know, statute, and you have your, then our regulatory authorities, where, you know, currently where we have regulatory authorities would not necessarily get at some of the imperfections that we have seen in the market around the purchase of drugs to encourage a resilient supply chain. And so this would enable the linking of Medicare payments to practices that encourage supporting resiliency in the overall supply chain.
Thank you. I did just want to ask one question that we've received from our audience online, and that's after the dramatic supply chain shortages identified in COVID. What lessons learned are government agencies adopting into their work and the partnerships with drug developers to reduce supply chain problems?
I'll start.
I was looking right at you.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of lessons learned. I think the one that was most stark was that we are not self-reliant in the United States, right? So we're very vulnerable. There were actually countries that were sole source suppliers for many of our medicines, and they closed their borders. So as a nation, I think there was a recognition, and I don't think it was a surprise because offshoring has happened, especially for the API industry for, you know, a few decades. We used to be the leaders here in the United States, and it was recognized, oh, we can do it cheaper if we move it offshore, and that's evolved. So we've recognized that we got to go back, right? So we're working on that specifically in my group. And also the recognition as we've started making investments is this is not a quick fix either. And it does cost quite a bit of money to bring the technologies back, develop them into advanced manufacturing technologies that are not the same and that are more cost effective. And then do we need to invest in new facilities, or can we reuse unused capacity that we have domestically? But also what are incentive to some of the companies? And as many of us know, generics are not a high profit product. So we need to invest in companies that have one, experience. We have been approached during COVID by a lot of companies who they wanted to get in the market, but they really did not have the technology and the experience to do that. So from a due diligence perspective, as we're making awards, they're higher risk for us. But also have a portfolio of other products that might not be generics, but other things that will help them be sustainable in the long term. And that's something we are struggling with now. As we've made investments, how do we make sure those companies take their products all the way to commercialization so they actually can get to that point, and then they have a market, because they're still going to compete with global suppliers. So how do we incentivize? What are the other levers and things that we need to look at as kind of a whole of government to help sustain the domestic manufacturing that is needed, that we're investing, again, billions of dollars in. How do we make sure that they're sustained and they're here, you know, not just for the next couple years until they finish the facility that they're working on, or, but that they are here for the next 5 years or 10 years, so that when the next public health emergency does occur, you know, we're not in the same situation and as vulnerable as we have been in COVID.
And I would say, I mean, certainly, you know, during COVID, as we said, there was just a surge in demand related shortages. We don't have the authority to require reporting on that. There was, you know, voluntary reporting and during COVID, which was really helpful. And as I said, the earlier we hear about something, the better off we are. We have a legislative proposal asking for that authority, which would greatly help us as well. I think the other thing we did was you know, there were so many things going on at once, and we certainly have all the data, we're able to access it, but we took some actions to bring all our data into even a more, you know, accessible and easily analyzable, so that we had much more quicker visibility in any supply chain that we wanted to look at. You know, but again, until we have, you know, what Armin is talking about, these incentives to sort of change where the drug, you know, if the drug is still coming from a place and it's still sole source and they, you know, need it, then it's going to be, or devices and other things like that.
So I think a follow-up question, and you all touched on this in your opening remarks, but what are some immediate next steps that you will be taking, both as part of your cross HHS collaborations, but in your respective agencies, perhaps that you could share with the larger group?
I can start also, and I've alluded to this, we've excuse me, we're continuing with our investments with API manufacturers. I have to say, again, it's the tip of the iceberg so far. There's a lot more that we have to do. We have had really, I would say, a lot of positive response. We have 2 efforts already that are in progress. We're actually using the ReVAMP Consortium. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that. That is being run through our sister organization, BARDA, within ASPR. And through that consortium, we had 2 efforts for onshoring of APIs and KSMs. One was using advanced manufacturing technologies, and one was using bio-derived methodology, again, looking at these alternative mechanisms. And we had huge response. We had actually, I want to say, 19 to 23 proposals that were presented to us, which was great. So that tells us there's a lot of interest in the industry and a lot of really good proposals. So from that perspective, our only limitation is funding, right? So as we get more funding, we're going to be looking at a lot of these companies and going back to, and actually the consortium has a unique process, which is nice. Based on the funding, we'll make some awards, but then those that we don't have funding for, they put them in a basket. So when we do get funding, we don't actually necessarily have to go through the whole full solicitation process. We already have the information from those companies, and we can make those awards a lot quicker. One of the other things that we're looking at specifically from ASPR is authorities for contracting, because we also recognize contracting with private sector, and especially in the pharma industry, is not necessarily the same as working in other industries, especially because a lot of things are commercial. So we're looking at other authorities on different mechanisms for contracting to make it easier and more appealing to private sector companies in the industry to partner with us, and not necessarily have to share all of their cost accounting principles as they would with a regular FAR-based contract. So looking at OTAs, looking at some of the authorities the DoD had that we utilized during COVID, such as the commercial services opportunity, I believe it is, the CSO. So we are also looking at other authorities that might help make it easier for us to partner with private sector so that we can move forward with a lot of these initiatives. Again, knowing we want to do as much as we can early, because it's going to take a couple of years for the development and actual commercialization for some of these products.
Thank you. Mina, what about you? Next steps?
Yeah, I think what I mentioned in my opening remarks are some of the immediate near-term actions that we're taking, given the, legislative authority that we have. I think, Rebecca spoke to the white paper where, we put forward, here are some things that if there were funding, if there were legislative authority that we could do. I think the other thing is that we are very interested in continuing to hear ideas where there are things that, from what you're seeing on the ground that are within or our regulatory authority, we want to know so that we can figure out any other near-term, things that we can do as people are thinking about, like as we did in the white paper, kind of longer-term solutions.
Thank you. Jacqueline?
Yeah, I think, certainly we're working on the QMM initiative. As I said, we're in the process of sort of looking at a protocol that was developed and applying it, and that'll, again, develop hopefully a tool that can be used not only by us, but by others. We certainly, look forward to being, and we are at the table for these discussions and lending our expertise here. One thing that always comes up is transparency in the supply chain and where are things made. I mean, one of the things that we've had, and we've pushed a legislative proposal to ask for transparency in the labeling, so it's not just the repackager, so you understand who manufactured and who has the API. I think that would go a long way. I mean, obviously, we get that information, it's within our firewalls, but I think to allow folks to really understand a little bit more about the supply chains.
I don't have too much else. I think I've said a lot of what we're doing, and most immediately this action plan. I think I did not mention, the price tag that we had approximated with this proposal in the white paper, which was, I think Kristen alluded to it, not in the tens of billions of dollars, but in the $3 to $5 billion range, and a lot of that varies depending on the scope of products that are included, the level of the mix of incentives and penalties, the duration of those incentives, and then the amounts that's paid. So there's a range there. But I'm really curious to see how that all progresses, and I'm very encouraged by the Senate Finance's their own white paper and now legislation. But I think those are not immediate next steps, but I think that continuing that dialogue and finding what might be viable solutions to actually put into law and that we could carry out will be very important and interesting to see how that plays out. And then to Mina's point, just I think the continuing to work with industry, work on the ground, welcome your ideas as well as to what can be done to collectively mitigate. I don't think anybody wants shortages and these vulnerabilities. I don't think it's good for anybody. So what can we do to make sure the market is really functioning more effectively and with less failures, and working together on that, I think, not just within government, but with external partners.
You teed up my last question so perfectly. And then we will have a couple minutes, I think, for some questions from the audience. But my last question, we've talked a lot about federal coordination, but both you and Mina just said, there's a lot of voices that need to be part of the solution. So what are the opportunities for industry, for nonprofits, for academia? I'm looking at my people in the back for the ReVAMP Consortium. What do you need from us to help with the coordination that you just described, or for some of your other efforts? And then how do we get that information to you?
I think I would say that is the purpose. I mean, Rebecca, if you want to speak to having that coordinator office, because it's hard to know, right, who has what piece of it. And that's why, having that point of contact to provide ideas, and then that coordinates, with the rest of us. So Rebecca, I don't know if you want to talk more.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. The coordinator and facilitating some of these partnerships externally as well, and these conversations, we've already had a number of them, and we'll continue to do that. I think, I think that you heard from Jacqueline some of the, that we have, device and drug information, and that's been, becoming more and more robust. I mentioned earlier, I think some of the middle of the supply chain is an area where I think we would really benefit from some collaborations and understanding better how is that factoring into these market situations and influencing what manufacturers decide to do and then what hospitals decide to do as well. So I think that would be particularly an area for enhanced data and transparency. Yeah, I mean, there's, I think, a lot of different things have been said, but I don't have too much else to add on it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put a plug in because we have a mechanism in my group that has started in the last year called IBX Connect. So that is an online, and I'm sorry, I don't have the link to it, but you can Google it. It'll come up right on our webpage. And that's where we have an opportunity for companies to come in and share what their technology and what they can do in the API domestic manufacturing space. So they can request a meeting. They come in and it's an online meeting. And we have actually all of government or a wide variety of representation. We have FDA is there, CDC is there, NIH, State Department, DOD, of course, ASPR is there as well. So we have a lot of stakeholders, and it's an opportunity for companies to share what they have, because we recognize we don't know what you guys know. We don't know everything that's out there, what's in the landscape. So it's a vehicle for you to share, or companies to share what they can do, what their ideas are, what's their strategy. And it's before a formal solicitation. So it's a very open dialogue. We can give advice back on how it might fit into our mission in ASPR, or maybe it doesn't fit ours. It might fit better in the DOD, or it might fit better in NIH. So we can give a lot of that feedback to the companies, and even tell them this is not something that we think is going to be able to support a project that we have. So you might want to shift gears and look at it from a different perspective. So it's an opportunity to do that. And I think we've had really positive response from those meetings, excuse me, especially from newer companies with new ideas who are not well versed with government contracting and what the process is. So we can do a little bit of education there as well. So put a plug in for that. If it's something that you are interested in, or any of your stakeholders are interested in, please send them our way. Again, we want to know what's out there, and there's no guarantee of funding, and we might not call on you and ask for your help today or tomorrow, but it might be in 3 years, or it might be in 5 years when there's another pandemic. And we can look in our database and say, hey, we had this presentation from this company. Let's reach out to them and see if they have a solution that might be able to help us now. And then again, what we ask from industry is collaboration on your part as well, because as we are making investments, to us, it's a nice partnership when you have a company that has technology, and then you might have another company that's got the unused capacity, or that has another skill set that they can complement each other. So as we see companies that are working together, we see that as lower risk for investments from the government perspective. And again, as I mentioned, it often means there's a broader portfolio. They're working together, and they're at, the strengths of 2 companies or 3 companies working together is often better than just a new company or someone who hasn't had, experience with government contracting. So from us, those collaborations that we really like to see those, especially as we get proposals. I'll say it bodes a lot better, and it instills a lot of confidence as we're doing our technical evaluations.
Great, thank you. And Jacqueline, you're seeking transparency, you're seeking a better understanding of what potential problems, what do you need from
I think,
us?
the basic thing with the HHS white paper, I mean, we have to partner, first of all, we don't make the drugs, we don't manufacture, and that's really industry is the ones who are responsible for maintaining those resilient supply chains, but then we need the right incentives, right? And I think what you heard in the white paper, and I think Christine mentioned it, to the extent that we moved forward with a real quality sort of metric, that would be something that would have to be informed with the private sector. QMM may be part of it, but that's one aspect. And we talked about, it's not going to be just us going out and looking, and you're going to need the expertise of the entire community to really implement a program like that.
Thank you.
And I will just say, we have our rulemaking, like the buffer stock proposal, where people can provide comments. Similarly, we took comments on our draft guidances. So I think that is always an avenue. And if there is something in terms of Medicare policy, we have an open door, and we are happy to take meetings on absolutely anything. And if it is not within our authorities, we will say, that's a great idea. We do not have the authority to do it, or that's a different part of, CMS or a different part of HHS.
Right. And just to, I just want to kind of drive home, I don't know, it came up a lot in Kristen's comments in the beginning, but, I think part of what we're trying to get at here is how can the price is too low for a lot of these generic sterile injectables and generics, and it is not incentivizing manufacturers to really invest in resilient practices. And so what are the incentives? What would make you, or if you're in private sector, do that? What would make you want to make, and we've gone away from using the word quality, because it's not the quality of the products, as we've said, it's the resiliency of, like, you are not going to be disrupted in producing those. And so if there are other ideas, like, how do we get the right price, and how, like, what price would get you to do those things, and those sorts of things, and how can we get there? That's the major problem we're trying to solve for. And what we've put in the white paper is a more indirect mechanism to get there. There obviously are more direct ones of infusing, money and things like that, but into the plants themselves, for example. But problem solving and really thinking about what is going to make you want to do this, I think is really valuable information to understand.
Thank you. We do have a few minutes. See if there's any questions from the audience. Or if any of you have solved this question right here, just feel free to stand up and speak, answer. Yes.
I was just gonna ask about the control tower, right? So I think there are a lot of private entities that submit a great deal of information into the control tower, and how you see the next steps, or that effort, which really was born out of COVID, evolving and solving some of the data transparency issues we have.
And can you give a little info on a control tower?
Well, Rebecca might know this better than me, but I think the supply chain control tower, right, is, I know from a McKesson standpoint, we have a subset of items, essential medicines, that we submit a great deal of information around the supply chain to, but you also assimilate that across multiple entities, and it really provides good information around what's going on in the supply chain, in particular with the providers and potentially with the hospitals.
Yeah, I can take that, because the supply chain control tower is within ASPR. It's not actually within my group, but I'm very familiar with some of the work that they do. And you're right, they collect data predominantly from distributors on a specific set of COVID products. They were created during COVID. All their funding is COVID related, so everything they do has had to be COVID centric. So there are certain products that they are collecting data from the distributors, and they're monitoring trends right now. I would say during the height of COVID, it was much more critical, because they could see the dynamic changes in the supplies of things. Now that it's calmer, they're really doing more of a monitoring, and there's, less changes and less extremes in terms of supply. I will say, as we, and the concern with supply chain control tower is the funding. And I know I hate to be the one to bring up funding all the time, but they, at this point, don't have future funding to continue to working or expanding that role. Specifically in my department, as we are focusing, one of my domains is supply chain. We are looking to enhance our data collection as well. So it would be kind of an offshoot of the supply chain control tower, but we want to make it broader. So we are looking to add staffing and have an in-house capability to collect information from manufacturers and distributors on those types of things, on supplies. And it will be through voluntary data use agreements, because we don't have that authority to demand that from companies. But looking at having, again, that capability so that we can monitor what is going on in supply chain. API manufacturers is one of the key groups that we are looking at. And then also seeing how that information can be shared and help return it back to the industry, and see how that can be useful for you as well, in terms of you making decisions on capacity and things like that, and your supply and your production rates.
Any other questions? All right, we have one more. I think it's all.
More of a statement, and I appreciate the dialogue that we had. I'm Todd Ebert with the Healthcare Supply Chain Association, the GPOs, one of those middle groups that you're talking about. Rebecca, and, we have spent a fair amount of time working with IBMSC and Arlene's group, which has been very productive. And Jacqueline, a couple of our GPO members work routinely with the FDA on drug shortages and issues such as that, and it's been very effective as well. Information going both ways. But Rebecca, one area that, as you're making those your comments, which I thought were very helpful, is the fact that we have not spent any time with your organization. And I appreciate the fact that you're interested in learning more about certain parts of the supply chain, which we represent. And what I'd like to do now, I am the former CEO. I retired 3 days ago. And the new CEO is sitting right next to me.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. We need to connect so you can learn more about our efforts to try. We're not the bad guys in the middle of some. There's a lot that's being done to address these issues, to be good partners in the supply chain with the overall goal of treating patients. That's what we need to do, high quality patient care, and to solve this problem. So that's one of the key things, and I think valuable from my perspective, because I can turn it over to Angie too, to begin to connect you two together to have this discussion.
We would love that. We would welcome it. Yeah, people on my team.
All right. One quick question. Yes.
Okay, Fernando Mucio, Rutgers University. I'm one of those guys that has been working on advanced manufacturing running for 30 years. I just wanted to mention, right? I love what I heard. It's a very nice discussion, but seems a little reactive. And I was thinking, right, advanced manufacturing, if we want to get the best out of advanced manufacturing, would be very useful if we understood what are the goals the technology needs to achieve. So the technology could be developed purposefully and demonstrated for the intended need, right? Is there any work going on about creating a strategic plan or articulating a technology vision? Where do we need to be technologically speaking in 5 years or in 10 years? Any thoughts about that? Because for us in academia, that would be very useful.
I'm not from our advanced manufacturing group, so I don't know if we have one technology. I certainly think, and there may be, depending upon the product, the technology that works best. I think in general, what we see the potential is really sort of reducing breakdowns, errors, maybe efficiency and economies. But I'm not sure if we've, said there's one single thing. I think we're open to talking about all technologies that are fit for purpose for the drug.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would welcome if you want to come and speak with us, IBMC, about technologies in an IBX Connect meeting. We would love to have that. But I also think with the action plan that we're coming up with, it's going to be somewhat of a strategic plan. I know it'll show the gaps where we think we really need to work on. So I think when that eventually comes out, I think that's going to be a useful tool as well.
All right, with that, I'd like to thank my excellent panel and really got us off to a good start today. And thank you so much. Like Stephen back to the front.
Well, we should go here. I'll invite the next panelist to come up as well. Let's get to that. So as everyone's getting settled, thank you so much, Mary Ann, for moderating the first panel. Great discussion. Great to see the cross-cutting work across different federal agencies and the whole government approach being taken. It's really fantastic to see. Our next session is on measuring supply chain reliability. I'm Stephen Colville, Assistant Research Director with the Duke-Margolis Institute. I'm also the Executive Director of RISKS, a nonprofit supply chain rating and certification organization with a mission to prevent drug shortages. And I serve on the board of the End Drug Shortages Alliance. So in this session, we're going to talk about supply chain reliability, which at Duke-Margolis we've defined previously, and we're through our consortium to do so. And we've defined a reliable supply chain as one that ensures that patients have safe and effective drugs in adequate quantities when they're needed. And so to achieve that, to achieve consistent reliability, there are proactive investments that need to be made over the long term. Investments in things like quality management maturity, supply chain redundancies, risk management plans, excess manufacturing capacity, technologies, infrastructure, and other steps. And we know that different manufacturers have varying levels of reliability, even if they're producing drugs that are FDA approved, they're producing the same generic drug, doesn't necessarily mean that their supply chains are of equal reliability. So a first step towards improving and rewarding supply chain actors who are taking good steps is to reward those, or is to measure who is taking good steps and have ways to measure supply chain reliability. So looking forward to diving into that on our second panel here. So on the panel, we have Patrick Day, Principal Consultant at Lockman Consultants. Then we have Diane Husted, Chair of the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineering's Drug Shortages Team Initiative. Then Amy Cadwalder, Director of Regulatory and Public Policy Development at US Pharmacopoeia. Todd Ebert, now former, as you mentioned, President and CEO of the Healthcare Supply Chain Association. So congrats on your recent retirement 3 days ago, Todd. And then David Goff, Interim President and CEO of the Association for Accessible Medicines. I think you're down there. Yes. Hi, there you are. Good to see you. All right, so we've got a lot to cover. So I'll first just ask, maybe we can go down the line here, start with Pat and go through just 1 or 2 minutes of opening remarks, let everyone know your perspective, how you're working on this problem, and then we'll get into the details and the rest of the questions.
Yeah, so thanks everyone. My name is Pat Day, and this is kind of humbling to do this work, right? And I think we all have to take the humble pill when we do this, because at the end of the day, there's process, there's policy, there's money, but there's a patient, right? And if you've ever had the misfortune of having anyone who's been on the other end of a drug shortage, it's kind of been a cold water in your face. Okay, it really is. So I would say is everything we do has to have that in mind, right? I even want to do conferences and training, even mechanics. I tell them there's a patient at the end of your wrench. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are, there's a patient somewhere. Okay, so that's really important. So anyway, my primary goal is data governance, data integrity, data governance, and basically I'm a practitioner. Okay. I'm the person who's on the plant floor doing assessments, things like that. And what I definitely like to say is what's worse is I'm an engineer. Okay. So every problem I hear, I want to run around and fix. Okay. So my life is just a series of IPOs, input, process, output, input, process, output, input, process, output, connected. Right. But I think that's logical because when you look at organization maturity, right, you have dependent, independent, and interdependent. And I think the interdependent piece is what we're trying to achieve now. Because if you look back some time ago, last 20 years, some of you, that's not so long ago, okay, but some of you, that's forever. If you look at it, it was lean the supply chain, right? Just-in-time manufacturing. That's where the value is. Then people found the value in managing your supply chain in a lean way, right? Because that was a fundamental business objective. So look where we are now. We did a really, really good job at leaning the supply chain, but now it's biting us a bit. Okay. So how do we reverse that? Okay. So I just tell everyone, know your supply chain, right? Because I was talking the other day about, BSE, TSE, anyone remember that, right? And then you had to do those certifications and people were like, I have to know my supply chain, and that was kind of like the first foray in that area. Okay. So I'm not going to go too much into depth right now because we have a large panel, but it's just, how does this interdependence work, right? Think about my series of IPOs, right? Because remember, one company's or one site's output is another company's input, which is the difference between the lens you look at, what's a lead metric, what's a lag metric, and really getting more mature with risk management.
Excellent, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Husted. I chair the ISPE Drug Shortages Initiative, and it's simply an honor to be here today on behalf of that organization, but also just wonderful to see the broad level of stakeholders brought here together today to hear all the different perspectives and really benefit from seeing the different interdependencies, as you mentioned, in the complex environment that we're working in. I just want to highlight that my work with ISPE is volunteer. In my day job, I work at Merck and I'm in regulatory affairs with the US focus. But I just want to also qualify that all of my comments today are on behalf of ISPE. ISPE is a global pharmaceutical industry leader with the focus of harnessing pharmaceutical knowledge for the development of drugs to ensure operational excellence, inspire supply chain innovation, all for the purposes of supplying medicines reliably for patients and within the regulatory frameworks that we work in across the globe. And with all of that in mind, it is a complex environment, and we have many ongoing initiatives to address how manufacturers can do better in terms of supply resiliency. And I hope to share a lot of that insight with you today as we take forward the conversation.
And hi, I'm Amy Cadwallader. I'm here representing USP. I echo a lot of what you said. I'm very grateful to be here and talk to all of you. And it's heartwarming, to say the least, to see the broad diversity of folks in the room. And thank you, Stephen and the Duke-Margolis Institute team for putting this together. USP is an independent scientific global nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1820, and we're dedicated to building trust in medicines through really rigorous science, public quality standards, and related programs to that. We are governed by a convention of around 500 stakeholders in approximately 40 countries around the globe. So we have a lot of voices that we can talk to, that we learn from. And a core pillar of our mission is to strengthen the global supply chain so that medicines are available and meet quality standards for the patients who need them. And that's what we're going to talk about today, keeping quality at the forefront and how we incentivize quality and build resilience in the supply chain.
Thank you. I'm Todd Ebert. As Stephen said, I am the former CEO of the Healthcare Supply Chain Association. The good news, and that was 3 days ago, and the good news is my replacement is here, Angie Bolivar, a smart lady, is very well versed in group purchasing and how we operate. I'm pleased to be here for many of the same reasons. I like the fact that there are many different perspectives relative to this issue and how each organization comes at it a little bit differently. That's really good. After all, as I said a little bit earlier, we all have the same goal. We want to take care of patients. I am a pharmacist. I'm a registered pharmacist. I hate to admit this, but I've been a registered pharmacist for 45 years. As a hospital director of pharmacy, your goal was to take care of patients. And that's what we're all here trying to do, make sure that we have good, high quality products on a consistent basis to take care of patients. And that's what we do as well. And that's one of the driving goals of the group purchasing industry is, after all, the customers we have, providers, their goal is to take care of patients, help them have receive the products they need to take care of their patients. So it's good to continue to be part of this. We all want to be part of the solution. We, as a group purchasing organization, we represent many, not all of the group purchasing organizations out there, but our ultimate goal is a strong, resilient supply chain with all of the products that we work with. We go down a pathway of making sure that there's good, high quality products. There is no incentive at all to have shortages. In fact, it's antithetical to our business model. So our goal, as I said before, is a strong, resilient supply chain, even with the generic guys, David. I know. You go ahead. Okay.
What a handoff. I appreciate it. I'm David Goff. As mentioned earlier, I'm the interim president and CEO of AAM, Association for Accessible Meds. You might have known us years past as the Generic and Biosimilars Association. We represent 24 different companies, which sounds pretty small when I look at Jacqueline and know that she's working with some 300 generic companies as they put their ANDAs forward and work them through the process. But the 24 companies we represent are about 80% of all the drugs, which are 90% of the drugs that are provided in the United States. Drug shortages critically important to all of us up here. To me, I started working on drug shortage issues back in 2007 and 8 when the FDA list got up as high as 275. They've done a yeoman's job working with the industry to pull it back down to what was just under 100, I think about a year ago or so, but is now escalating back up. But I think it's important to know, and Jacqueline said this earlier, there are a couple lists out there. There's the FDA list, which only lists the national drug shortages. There's also an ASHP list, and I'm not saying anything against the ASHP list, but it lists close to 300, 330 drugs, because anytime somebody calls and says, I can't get this drug, it goes on their drug shortage list, which I think is a key point to think about. There are drug shortages and there are drugs not available at the moment. Both are critical issues, but both are solved in different ways. We're here talking about the drug shortage piece. We absolutely have to solve that, but there's also the drugs are not available piece that I think we need to pull into the picture as well. And that doesn't really have anything to do with resiliency or supply or quality. It just has to do with it's not available. I'm not going to get into that now. That's a whole nother story. It takes hours to go through that. But I think it's important to know, and we're all working for this. And the last point I would make, because, and I've had meetings with the FDA before, to say, as of today, we don't see this getting better. We're trying to get it better, but we see it getting worse before it gets better. So go back and think now, 4 years ago, COVID, and how we all came together during COVID to provide solutions quickly. And I do mean quickly because it turned around very quickly. Today, we seem to be doing several hundred one-offs conversations that isn't really getting to the heart of what the problem is. And so we need to get to that heart. There are multiple different issues within that heart, if you will. But I think we have to all kind of carve up the heart and work on that together. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. So as I mentioned in the opening, measuring reliability is what we're here to talk about. Measuring the relative reliability of drugs and manufacturers. So maybe I'll go to Amy first on this one, if that's okay. So could you, and then we'll go to others after you, but could you speak to what tools or programs or approaches, in your case, USP is using to measure reliability? You know, the medicine supply map obviously comes to mind here. So to take it away.
Sure, I can comment on that. In addition to USP standards and scientific solutions, we have developed a tool that Stephen mentioned called the Medicine Supply Map, and it uses multiple sources of information to identify global sites of pharmaceutical ingredient and finished dose product manufacturing. And forgive me as I need to make sure my numbers aren't wrong, so I'm going to peek down here. So we use over 40 data sets from US federal agencies as well as global agencies and other organizations, FDA, CMS, European Medicines Agency, World Health Organization. And these data are enriched with information about risk drivers, such as the price of the medicines and the ingredients. And it covers about 92% of FDA-approved generic prescription drugs. It includes over 250 million aggregated data points to evaluate indicators of drug shortage risk. And the model is also informed by insights on the use of USP's quality standards in over 80% of the finished dose and API manufacturing facilities that are FDA registered. And with all of these data and all of these data points, we found 4 risk categories that are correlated with increased drug shortage risk that either alone or in combination with each other can increase a medicine's risk for going into shortage. Those are geographic location. So those medicines that have a greater geographic concentration of where they're made have a higher likelihood of shortage. Think like a natural disaster or political issues, something like that. Manufacturing complexity of the medicine. So logic says that if it's more complicated to make the medicine, more things could go wrong. So that factors in. Of course, lower prices that we've heard about numerous times already today. Those drugs with low prices, that's common in older drug products, especially generics, have a higher risk of drug shortages. And the recent annual report that was mentioned earlier that we put out noted that about 60% of drugs that are less than $4 per unit currently. So that puts it into perspective. And the fourth risk factor is quality concerns. And we do note that quality challenges do predict increased vulnerability to drug shortages. And we've talked about some of those factors today. So that's a quick primer on our tool.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And Diane, perhaps you'd like to go next and talk about ISP's work in this area too?
Sure, thank you. So ISPE itself, it's a nonprofit organization that provides guidance to industry on how to do better with quality manufacturing and technical perspectives and regulatory compliance. So in and of itself, it doesn't measure supply resiliency. However, we have done a lot of work in understanding the challenges in the space. So last year we modernized our drug shortage prevention plan, and in the new model that we created, we've identified 12 performance areas that manufacturers need to focus on to ensure they're doing the very best that they can do for continuous supply. So we've noted here already quality. So of course that's in the drug shortages prevention model, but there's also other areas like cultural excellence, workforce capability, risk management practices, your digital solutions, advanced technology. There's a lot more, and we need to perform in these areas. Not just in one market, but across the globe. So within the regulatory framework across the globe, as well as over the life cycle of the product. So it gets complicated pretty quickly. So the help that we hope to bring to the table is to give the tools, the assessment tools, the understanding, the awareness of where manufacturers need to look. And one of the programs that we do have is called Advancing Pharmaceutical Quality, and it provides a pretty in-depth approach to a company to look at how they're doing in some of these quality spaces, where their maturity level is at the moment, and where they could get to, and how they can get to those next levels if need be. So that's really where we're focused. And right now we have under development a risk management guide based on the latest ICHQ-9 revision that focuses a lot more on product availability, or infuses a lot more perspective on product availability. So those are the tools that we're primarily resting on. And of course, our just general community of expertise is interested in taking this forward however we can.
Matt, you're definitely doing a lot of work at Lachlan with manufacturers in this area too.
Right. So one thing I always tell people is there's a lot of programs out there. And the first thing I would say, I always say I'm pretty practical. Don't create a new program. Okay. You probably have the data you need today. Sometimes you need a behavioral or a managerial change program on how to look at it different, right? Because I've irritated a lot of people at sites, right? And saying, well, did you look at it this way? This is what the data is telling me, okay? And when you look at some of the academic work, especially what St. Gallen's has done, which was really a huge input in the QMM program, which I'm a huge advocate of, it's the bringing together of the business objectives and the quality objectives, okay? And I think that's huge because one depends on the other, and the data is the currency we need to spend. So, and I said, being an engineer, I've been in a lot of the capital planning meetings, right? They're interesting, okay? And it's really, how do we bring the business objectives, the quality objectives together with the goal of ensuring the supply chain, okay? And then how do we link these together? Really, really a big opportunity and a big plug for the guidance that's out there for the risk management plans across your supply chain. I'm a huge advocate of that. And when you look at it across a supply, okay, again, it's that interdependency. To me, that guidance really shouts, doesn't speak to, it shouts. Go look across your supply chain and know where your risks are. Because where we audit today, we audit a site, right? A site gets findings, right? Maybe we need to transform that in some sort of a change management program that says, let's audit the supply chain.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pat. Maybe now we'll go down to David and then Todd to share your perspectives on this too.
I'm not gonna be able to share a whole lot because, as I said, we represent 24 different companies, and as Pat and my other two colleagues have already said, there are multiple different ways. Don't start a new program. I like that one. But each of our companies handle this in a different process. There is not one system. There are multiple programs currently out there. So to be able to say to you that yes, every one of them is doing just that. They are developing their products, working with the FDA to get approval for that. Quality is part of that approval process, and it's an ongoing part of the process that the FDA reviews year over year. So I would just say that our organizations are committed to quality, absolutely. But there's the other pieces of the supply chain that get to resiliency. Each of them does that differently, and so I'll stop there.
And Todd, when you go and speak to how your member organizations do assessments of supply chains, that leads also into my next question, which I was going to be thinking about too, around so how is information that's once it's generated by different measurement tools or programs, how's that information used and factored into contracting decisions, purchasing decisions, and ultimately enabling high performing manufacturers to be successful?
Thanks, Stephen. Pretty much consistent with a lot of the feedback so far is the information that we want and use from a group purchasing standpoint is very important. Although we don't get as much information as we would want, there's not as much as we need from the standpoint of determining where the strongest supply chain is, and they continually look for that. They, meaning the GPOs, they do operate a little bit differently, like David's explained with a number of the manufacturers, but they all have this ultimate purpose in mind, and that is a strong, resilient, high-quality supply chain that they can trust that would provide the product to the patients or to the providers that treat patients. That's what they're looking for. Now, how do they get that? We work very closely with our membership. Members are on every decision-making committee when it comes to the products in a group purchasing organization. I can speak to pharmacy. When I ran a pharmacy program for a national group purchasing organization, the pharmacists throughout the membership, they sat around the table with us as we made decisions relative to what to do. And that has evolved now, that they're looking for much more information. Yeah, can they tell you their experience in the marketplace, what they see? Can they tell you if they have issues relative to quality? There's issues many times with a potential particulate matter in generic sterile injectables. So they'll tell you about that. They'll tell you who has the best services, et cetera, but they're also looking for more information. For example, one of our member GPOs maps out the entire supply chain as much as they possibly can, all the way from API to key starting materials to manufacturing, where they're getting their glass bottles and their rubber stoppers from, all the way to where it's as I said, manufactured, shipped, and stored and distributed. They want to know that. They want to know the strength of that supply chain, i.e., do you have multiple sources of API in case there's a problem with, and geographical different sources of API where you store products as well. They're looking for all that information. That is a key element in the decision-making process relative to what products are awarded on contract. It is more important, very candidly, than the price. They're looking for, again, high quality. We want to see organizations, generic manufacturers stay in business. We want a strong generic manufacturer organization. So all that information is utilized. I know that they utilize as much information as they can from other sources that's available to see, but we continue to look for more. We propose and we support the QMM process because again, we're looking for consistency in the information that's available. And very candidly, many times it's consistency. It's understandable and relatively simple and straightforward to use, so we can make good comparisons relative to the strengths of the supply chain.
And thanks, Todd. Just to build on that, QMM obviously is in early stages of development, and many other programs that measure reliability are pretty early on or nascent. Could you speak to steps, like what steps you think we should take to help them develop and mature and be more validated and used more actively throughout the industry?
Well, we have spent a lot of time working with congressional staffs on Capitol Hill relative to the importance of QMM and the fact that there needs to be funding. And then also, let's move along as quickly as we can. But that, and then at the same time, to get the attributes, because I believe that the FDA has a lot of data, a lot of data that can be used to go through an evaluation process for scoring that then can be used by various purchasers within the process to utilize or to make decisions. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're very clear on what attributes that are needed for a healthcare provider or purchasing providers to be able to determine what's best for the organization.
Great, makes sense. Anyone else want to chime in and just give thoughts on maybe specifically around the programs that you've mentioned or the initiatives that you've worked on? What do you see as needed to take it to the next level?
Yeah. So I think in terms of taking it to the next level, I'd like to see the continuation of interaction with industry on just general perspectives. I think today is an excellent start in the consortium, and in general is an excellent step forward. The fact is that if we start working towards solutions, some of the ideas that we have, early on we were talking about quality initiatives and recognized, I heard a few of us recognize that quality is part of the conversation, but there's more to supply resiliency than just quality. So having some sensitivity around, how to build the next steps is good, and getting that into industry interaction for further context and awareness of interdependencies is really important. We don't want to create any challenges with patient mistrust or panic buying or anything of that nature, trying to take things forward in a positive way. And in terms of interdependencies, I think it might be important to draw out is we work in a global community, many of us in the manufacturing arena. Either we're sourcing from other markets or we're providing product to other markets and working in their regulatory frameworks. And the divergence of quality, regulatory expectations for keeping your registrations current is challenging. So if you're registering your product and you're using a particular process and so forth, and you identify an improvement that would be helpful, if you're looking at a 5 to 7 year horizon to get that approved globally for all the markets you do business in, it can be a deterrent to go forward with that. And so I think it's really important that we think about the unintended consequences that could occur, or as well the interdependencies. So I would look forward to continued interactions between industry and the key thought leaders trying to move this forward.
It just that, not complete, but add.
Go ahead.
I just encourage people to start layering your thinking, okay? Because it's not one industry, right? I always tell people, think about the branded product. That's one way of thinking. The generic sterile, that's another way of thinking. And the third is the OSD. That's another way of thinking. The risk appetite is much, much different, okay? The ability to put capital in is much, much different. So what you will do there is a different mitigation plan. If you look at everything as it's one homogeneous supply chain, I think you tend to sort of miss the point, okay? And then with that, when you go those different layers, think about your people, your process, your systems, and most importantly, it's all underpinned by culture, right? Because the technology is outpacing it. We don't have a technology problem. We do not have a technology problem. We have a people problem catching up to the technology, okay? So what I would say is just leverage that and know where you're deficient.
I want to build a little bit on a couple of things I heard as well. I think building off of what you said, Diane, and what I heard Rebecca say in the first panel is we need to talk a lot. We need to keep talking a lot. We need to be having a lot of these conversations to really learn how to incentivize the resilience that we need. And I think establishing some of these public-private partnerships is a good step in that direction. You know, USP, we sit uniquely in the nonprofit sector where we have relationships with a lot of people in the sector and have been listening to a lot of these conversations as well. So I think that continuing to get together like this is really important. And another thing, building off of something Pat said, is thinking about risks and identifying risks. One of the things that USP is thinking about is how can we leverage our tool to help identify some of these risks, for example, through something like the establishment of a vulnerable medicines list. If we can identify some of those medicines that right now appear to be really vulnerable from our predictive analysis, that's somewhere to start. Instead of thinking about thousands of drug products, it's a place to start at a minimum. So,
David, do you have any comments? No. Can I use your time?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The one thing I would say is, and don't take this the wrong way, quality is not the only thing. When you're talking about a resilient supply chain, quality, absolutely extremely important. But let's go back to COVID again for just a minute. Who knew that a majority of the products, both brand and generic, supplied in the United States, flies in the belly of a passenger plane? We didn't know that until all of them came to the ground and then realized, how are we going to get this product moved? So I think to Todd's point a minute ago about the GPOs needing to understand the many parts of resiliency and what do we need to do to affect those. It's a daunting task, but that is what we really need to focus on. And, you know, this goes to both generic and brand products. There are these same issues across the board. We are a global industry, if you will. There's a lot of talk about bringing it all back to the US, and we are very supportive of bringing to the US. I don't think you'll ever see it all come to the United States. It just can't happen. I'll pick on the Novartis people sitting up here in front. They're a Swiss company. Aren't most of or many of their plants going to be in Switzerland? And why would they duplicate them to move them to the United States or to Japan or to Australia, whatever the case may be? There are a lot of decisions that go into that. So I think we just have to think about quality, yes, absolutely important, but there are so many other important parts of resiliency. I'll stop there, Todd. I'm taking your time.
Time I wanted to take from you.
I do think that's a really important point, David, about quality being a really important component of the overall supply chain, and evaluating the overall supply chain needs to be taken into consideration. And actually, a few of the proposals on next steps that I've been talking about in the previous panels. One, the Senate Finance draft proposal of their Drug Shortage Prevention and Mitigation Act, proposed act. One of the things included in there was a promotion of drug product quality initiatives, and actually in our what they call drug product quality initiatives, and actually in our public comment responding back to that, we recommended as a consortium and as Duke-Margolis recommended, reframing that to drug supply chain reliability issues to look at quality, but also other things like redundancy and risk mitigation plans and things that have been talked about. So just want to ask this panel's perspective on that proposal. How do you think, what could Congress do to, and others do to promote the use of more drug supply chain reliability initiatives? And not just that proposal, but also the other proposal that was brought up frequently, the HHS white paper that proposed a manufacturer resiliency assessment program. And of course, there's lots of similarities and potential similarities between those two different proposals. But just like to open it up to your thoughts on those proposals as next step. Where do you see this going next? What can we as a group do to continue advancing the conversation?
Well, if I can take my time and
Go ahead.
Todd, then I can cover a lot. You know, first off, the Senate Finance legislation, we think is a very well thought out program. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. They never are when they first come out. Excuse me, but very well thought out. And it leads to a couple things that were talked about in earlier panels. Is price an issue in the resiliency and the sustainability of our industry? Yes, it absolutely is. But that's not the only thing that is of concern to the generic and biosimilar industries. The other piece of that is having an understanding of what you need to have and to have consistency. So if I have a contract that gives me a better price, but the next day my contract is canceled because somebody else came along with a good price, that isn't helpful for the industry, because now I don't have an understanding of what my long-term commitment is and what I need to do with my facilities. If you look at a brand versus generic, for example, brand companies, not always, but typically have, quote, one line for one product or one line for two or three products. In the generic industry, you're talking one line, and we may have multiple lines, of course, but one line for 30 to 40 products that are made on that line. And so it's moving all the time, and it has to be at 92, 94% capacity to be there. So with that, we see that the Senate Finance Committee is addressing a lot of that piece and part, if you will, but it needs to go a little bit further. We looked at the price and the rebates that are built in there, but it seems like we're getting one and giving up another. And so does that really make sense? So hopefully I've taken up most of Todd's time.
You did, so we'll take Amy's time, okay? I'll just be really brief. We are supportive of where the Senate Finance Committee is going. We do think, and we do believe that there is a need to provide more revenue in the form of higher prices for generic pharmaceuticals. It's gotten really low. We get that. We understand that. So is there a method to do that? And who's the biggest payer in the US? It's Medicare. And is this a way to be able to address that? Yeah. Now, some of the challenges that we see out there from the Senate Finance Committee plan is there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out, a lot. And so what we'd like to see, and I asked this question earlier with the initial speaker, is how they envision the public-private working relationships going together. Our concern is, and our hope is, that there's a lot of listening that goes on with the private sector, simply because there's a lot of experience, there's a lot of expertise, and a huge desire to be part of the solution. And the concern is that we don't want it to go down a pathway, and someone might say, well, we can fix that later on. By the time that happens, there's going to be some unintended consequences. We want to address that. So our suggestion, one of our suggestions, was that public-private working relationship has to start quickly, so that some of these things can be addressed very early, and so that we can coordinate with the industries that are trying to solve this problem.
Now I'm gonna take Diane's time.
I'm gonna get stuck at the end.
Now, I think I can be quick. I think I've already answered some of this with identifying the risks. I think we need to start somewhere. What's vulnerable? Where can we work on mitigation quickly? I'm gonna agree with my colleagues up here and say that we need to think about how to incentivize resilience, and establishing these public-private partnerships and having the conversations is really important to figure out some mechanism or way that we can reward manufacturers for investments in quality, resilience, reliability. And finally, we haven't talked much about it on this panel, but we need to incentivize modernization and updating and advanced manufacturing technologies as well. So I think those three pieces are steps we're thinking about next.
All right, so I still have time. So I would echo a lot of the comments that you just heard, and maybe I'll just bridge on what Amy was talking about. In particular, when we talk about advanced manufacturing, it may not be a level playing field for generics. So they don't have necessarily, and probably in most cases, all the insights to what happened in development. And if they're manufacturing and they're trying to do the very best they can operationally, they may want to make improvements and to jump to advanced manufacturing may introduce challenges for them that really make it just an unsustainable business model. And so I think ISPE's perspective is certainly we embrace advanced manufacturing, and we have lots of support and expertise on that and resources for anyone's consumption. But also think about emphasizing, for the purposes of shortages prevention and ensuring supply resiliency, emphasizing continual improvement and not necessarily advanced manufacturing as a path forward to ensure that you're bringing everyone along and moving the whole progress forward.
Thanks. Wrap it up.
Yeah, just briefly, I said I'm pretty practical, right? It's one is, don't wait for Congress to tell you what you think you should already know, okay? You know what you need to do. Perform some experiments. Try some small experiments, learn, okay? That's how you're gonna learn. Do some small experiments along the way, absolutely. Two is, we talk about quality, but talk about the QA organization. Invest in their capability, in their digital capabilities, okay? Because there's a pretty good gap there in the traditional QA organization and how you increase their digital capabilities, because that's where the benefits are going to come in the future, but invest now.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was a really great discussion. We're gonna go to a short break.
All right, welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our third panel today, focused on realigning incentives for reliability. I'm Thomas Rhodes. I'm a senior policy analyst here at the Duke-Margolis Institute, and along with Steve and I co-lead our ReVAMP supply chain consortium. We've heard the word incentives about 1,000 times so far today. So I think we're all in agreement that aligning incentives properly is a really critical part of this effort. And so that's what we're going to be diving into on this panel today. Generic drug markets in particular really focus on the lowest price at a point in time, as we've heard from several others so far. And sometimes that can come at the expense of reliability and sustainability over the long term. So in this panel discussion, we're going to talk about what can be done to better realign those incentives toward reliability. I'll start by introducing our panelists for this session. Starting from my left, we have Mikel Mestrinaro, Global Head of Policy for Novartis. Next is Nicolette Louis-Saint, Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategic Planning at the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. Next down there is Eric Tichy, Division Chair for Supply Chain Management at the Mayo Clinic. And lastly, in the AAM slot at the end is Craig Burton, Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategic Alliances at the Association for Accessible Medicines. Thanks so much for joining us, to all of you, and we'll start again with a few minutes of opening remarks from each panelist. I'll start on my left with Mikel.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Pleasure to meet you. As per the introduction, I'm Michele, the Global Head of Policy for Novartis. A global pharmaceutical company. We operate in about 155 countries, not only in Switzerland, we'll get back to that. And then we engage globally on issues of security and supply. The conversation that we have today here in DC, we have in Brussels, we have in Tokyo, many times we have in Beijing. So what you're seeing here is a challenge that is shared, is a challenge that is not localized. And many of the solutions that we're discussing and many of the challenges that still remain are the same globally. We have a view on some of the proposals that we will articulate through the questions. Just to give you a quick highlight as we get started with the conversation, we do believe that demand incentives are helpful. They're not, however, helpful at any price. And that is something that countries have learned the hard way, as we will go into some of the examples. Because the point was made that no one makes money from stockouts. And that is correct. Equally, it can be cheaper to stock out than to not. And that is part of the reason why we see some of the issues that we see, particularly in generics. The second part is that this demand incentives should not be and cannot be a backdoor towards localizing supply chains on one side, value chains more broadly into any one specific country. Fundamentally because we don't believe that is helpful. Alina made a point earlier that the US particularly is not self-reliant when it comes to medicines and when it comes to the medical supply chain. No country is in the world, and it is not really not something that we're going to see regardless of what we do in terms of location of supply chain. And finally, there is definitely a role to play for buffers and for a degree of stockpiles, understanding clearly what it is that we are buying with that, which is primarily time. But there are things that you can all stockpile. You can all stockpile innovation. The only way in which you can have that locally is by having a thriving, competitive industry. And it's one that is increasingly not applicable for some of the modern therapies that we're making fun. Pleasure to be here with you and to engage in the conversation.
Thanks so much. And we'll just carry on down the row so you can do the next, Nicola.
I know you have a lot of questions, so I'll be very quick. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. Nicolette Saint, Head of Policy and Strategic Planning for the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. For those who are not familiar, HDA's members, our 39 members, move about 10 to 12 million products to 300,000 sites of care on a daily basis. So reliability, resilience, the ability for the supply chain to continue to operate and deal with surges large and small is really fundamental to what we do and our ability to ensure continuity of the supply chain. Many of you have heard me talk about these proposals and how we think about shortages. I'll just say when we think about incentives, a lot of what we continue to impress is that incentives have to look different for different parts of the supply chain. Sounds obvious, don't always see that show up in policy, but also we have to think about what the incentives are actually looking to incentivize. Again, sounds obvious, doesn't always show up in policy. So when we're thinking about the ability to manage supply-driven shortages, demand-driven shortages, GSI shortages, things of that nature, there's a nuance there that's incredibly important. And if we aren't dealing with the root causes, we're going to see a lot of investment that falls short in a few years. That's my upbeat welcome. So
Thank you. Hi, Eric Tishy. I'm Division Chair of Supply Chain Management at Mayo Clinic, essentially responsible for the pharmaceutical supply chain at Mayo. We're a large healthcare provider, and shortages have been a huge issue for us. I think when you talk about solutions to shortages, we've been sort of very earnest in our efforts. We are members of the End Drug Shortage Alliance. I'm actually the immediate past chair of that entity. We are founding and governing members of Civica RX. We're also very active in our GPO, which is Vizient, and we participate in their supply resiliency programs. We were one of the first organizations to sign up for that program. And we're also active in our trade organizations, American Society of Health System Pharmacists, American Hospital Association. And we constantly bring these issues of drug shortages to them. And it really is sort of heart-wrenching, some of the issues that we have to deal with at a provider level when you don't have enough of the products that you need to take care of patients. We definitely have a lot of talented people spending an inordinate amount of time on this activity. I think even myself, I used to be a frontline clinician taking care of patients, and somehow I got sucked up into this vortex of like, how do we solve drug shortages? And I feel like it's becoming a world hunger thing, but I think we're making more progress on world hunger over the last 10 years than we are in drug shortages. So that's kind of my provider perspective. And I did think it was interesting, we heard earlier the talk about like quality, and I think there's becoming like this misperception that the drugs themselves that are available aren't of good quality. And to me, they're really all similar. I mean, by definition, these are commodities. They're supposed to be indistinguishable from each other clinically. And so when we talk about quality, it's really quality of a manufacturing process that's reliable so that it doesn't lead to issues of disruption. And so now the $1 million question to me, when you get to the incentives, is I have a really hard time knowing who's going to be reliable. And so if you want to change my behavior to purchase from reliable suppliers, I need the information of who's actually reliable. Because honestly, I would do that with the current incentives if I really had good visibility to that. So pass it on to Craig.
So thanks, Eric. Craig Burton with Association for Accessible Medicines, representing generic manufacturers. Yeah, a couple thoughts. First of all, jumping off what Eric said, I love that someone commented earlier. It's probably better to talk about resilience than quality. I actually think that we're on very thin ice and dangerous ground when we throw around words like quality causing drug shortages. You know,
folks in this room understand what that means. But the reality is that there's a broad swath of shortage causes that are dropped into a really big bucket titled quality. And if we're not careful, we're going to undermine people's willingness to take generic drugs in the first place. You know, I loved what Patrick and Nicolette just said. I think as we're digging into these things, it's really important to make sure we understand the markets we're talking about. The solutions that apply to the brand drug market, you know, for most of what Novartis is producing are irrelevant to the discussions that generic manufacturers are having. And even there, you've got different conversations for oral solid than for sterile injectable. We have seen time and time again where policymakers have implemented policy with a broad brush, thinking that a drug is a drug is a drug, and that has caused significant harm to the generic industry that the industry is still suffering from. You know, so then, you know, as we think about incentives, great to talk about incentives. But I think someone on the administration panel earlier talked about, what about the price? And is any of this resulting in greater value to the generic manufacturers? So a couple data points. Last 5 years, the total value of all generics sold in the US declined by $6.5 billion. That includes every new generic launch that happened in those 5 years. The total value went down by $6.5 billion. So every generic script is worth less today than it was 5 years ago. Find me an industry with a similar track record that is healthy. I would love to see it. I don't think it exists. As David said, we think we have been predicting this for a number of years. We've been talking about sustainability of the industry for a number of years, and now, unfortunately, that those birds are coming home to roost. So, with that in mind, it's great to talk about incentives.
You find emails.
But unless we address the fundamental sustainability of the market, all we're going to be doing is patching a dam that's leaking, and we're just going to be putting more and more patches on that dam. So that means, yes, looking at what Senate Finance is doing, and conceptually, we're very interested in what they're doing. A lot of questions, as I think most folks do. But, you know, and there's some values. You think about predictability of contracts. But is that going to result in price? I don't know. It's an open question. But there are other things that also put us into this mess. We have a generic inflation penalty in the Medicaid program that was tailored to the brand drug industry, and that results in generic manufacturers paying penalties when they don't take a price increase. Tell me how that makes sense. You have the story that everyone in this room grew up hearing, that when a new generic launches, within 6 months, the generic is at 90% lower price and 90% of market share. Well, the first part of that story is true, at 90% lower price, but the second part is no longer true because of rebate gains. It is now taking years for new generics to get market share. And as those new higher value products are squeezed, that puts more and more pressure on these commoditized products that already face challenges. So I'll throw that out there and go from there.
All right, thank you all for the opening remarks, and I appreciate the points made there about clarity of terms and being specific about what we're looking to incentivize around resilience and reliability specifically. So my first question is, I think, follows up closely on what Craig just raised, so maybe I'll come back to you first, actually, is whether the recent proposals from HHS and Senate Finance that take this demand side approach that we've been talking about, working to drive increased demand to more reliable manufacturers, is that an approach that can start to get at some of those market issues that you were mentioning? Can it be part of the solution among the others that you raised?
Maybe.
Care to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the concept is a good one of reward providers for potentially paying more for quote unquote reliable products. It's a 102-page legislative draft. There are a lot of questions that we've had as we've dug through there that frankly, we need to figure out what the intent is before we can comment on whether we like it or not. But at the end of the day, it's not yet clear to me. I mean, you're building a policy race based on a rather large assumption, which is that more money is going to go to the generic manufacturers. And there are a lot of people in that supply chain who are going to touch that money before it gets to a manufacturer. So you're not changing anything about Part B reimbursement that has created this. You're not changing anything about Part A reimbursement, which has created this race to the bottom. So there's kind of this assumption that it will allow ASPs to float upwards over time. Not clear to me yet that that's the case. And I think that's something, truthfully, that we're still digesting. And that's one of the larger lenses that we're looking at there.
Mikhail, anything you would want to add there? Obviously acknowledging that, as Rick said, the market looks a little bit different from your perspective, but you want to weigh in?
No, happy to round it out with a specific example, because I think that we actually see eye to eye on it. And we have some experience with it because Novartis used to have a large generics division until about a year ago. And an example of a country that has enacted some of these reforms and has had a version of committed contracts for many, many years, since let's say 2008, is actually Germany, in the way in which it has used these programs to drive down the generic prices by actually having, you have predictability of demand for 2 years. You are one of the 1 or 2 or 3 companies to actually do it. But that tool was not used to increase resilience. That tool was used to try to squeeze out the last penny from that particular product. And therefore, the tool per se, can it be helpful? It can. If it's used to provide predictability of demand under particular conditions, sure. Is it by itself going to be helpful? We actually have examples from elsewhere in the world where, unless that is directed correctly, they can actually exacerbate the problem.
Anything that Nicolette and Eric, you would want to add there? Maybe building on that last point around maybe what elements of a committed contracting approach would be critical to making sure this actually provides greater stability and certainty in the market for generic manufacturers, or any other thoughts you have?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. The model that we sort of are part of with Civica, that's a big part of the model, is making 5-year commitments. And the thought is that allows the manufacturer to make long-term investments. So you can kind of create a win-win where you make a long-term commitment, maybe you get a stable price, but it allows for capital investments to be made. So I think there has to be some interplay to understand, hey, are those capital investments being made, and not just sort of funding like other activities or something along those lines. But I can understand how that could also be an opportunity to extract more sort of like value from a potential partner. So I think that's a fair point.
In theory, the committed contract model could help. It depends on a lot of things that we've not yet clarified. I think right now, the working assumption for committed contracts is that reliability hinges on committed contracts. Not entirely sure that's true. So a factor, not sure it's the only one. So if we're not dealing with, as Craig said, reimbursement, if we're not ensuring that the money is actually flowing back to the manufacturer, thinking about how we actually create runway so that there can be these investments made and that this doesn't become punitive for the generics market, we're not focusing on generic market sustainability. We could actually have committed contracts for manufacturers that decide that this is not an environment that they can continue to operate in. And so I just want to make sure that we're really clear on which problem we're looking to solve. There is a problem, as Craig identified, of generic market sustainability. And there is a consequence that is a separate problem that we've been talking about, which is the supply side drug shortages phenomena. I think one of those can be addressed with committed contracts, but not necessarily the other.
This makes sense, yeah. And one of the things we've thought about here at Duke-Margolis is we've written comments on the Senate Finance proposal and thought about other proposals in this space is maybe a role for some sort of public-private partnership working to ensure that these things are implemented correctly. As you, I think, all mentioned, there are a lot of details that need to be worked out to make sure this works right. And maybe to hold the different stakeholders accountable that healthcare institutions are actually using these to provide more commitment to their suppliers, not just squeeze out more value. That manufacturers are actually using some of the increased prices, if that happens, to reinvest in reliability, and that some of those funds are actually flowing through to enable better manufacturing. I want to pivot a little bit to the provider healthcare institution role here. The demand side proposals are kind of asking providers and healthcare institutions to take on maybe a more proactive role than they've thought about historically in their purchasing and think about their role in the supply chain. And obviously, we all know that providers are already very burdened from all of their work caring for patients, and we don't want to add to that burden with a proposal that puts more work on the healthcare provider level. Maybe starting with Eric, anything that we can do to ensure that this type of approach, focusing on the purchasing level, isn't unduly burdensome for the provider?
Well, I do think if we could have better visibility into who are the providers or the suppliers that are reliable or predictors of reliability, that would be really helpful and could guide our purchasing decisions better. One of the things I worry about is right now we really don't have that visibility, and I think you could put those incentives in place and then we'd be sort of like just guessing. And then I think it's also a fair point that you put those demand side incentives in place, and does it really sort of trickle down, to the supplier where it's most needed. There is a concept of like the leaky bucket, and so is this one of those examples where the bucket is almost empty by the time it sort of makes its way down to the manufacturer, who is theoretically the one that needs it? So one of the things that I wonder is, well, why don't you inject support into those suppliers? So if they're having a hard time funding capital improvements, could HHS or some coordinating body provide loans or even forgivable loans or grants or something along those lines to help? That way you're directly getting into sort of where the problem is, or where the need is.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, you want to jump in, Craig?
And one thing I want to throw out is, Craig, you mentioned this, and I kind of empathize with this, the conflation of like the brand and generic manufacturers. I think from a public sentiment standpoint, there's not a lot of appetite to like give pharma money. And a lot of that is there's this like bias against branded manufacturers. And we kind of, really, it would be in our best interest to separate that mentally, because whatever you think about the ROI that branded manufacturers have, the generic manufacturers don't have that. Now, part of the reason why those get conflated is sometimes you have these multinational companies that have generic divisions, and but I think that has been one of the challenges, is that publicly people say, well, we're not going to get pharma money. It's got to like flow through all these different layers before it gets there. So we make ourselves kind of feel like we're not giving pharma money.
Amen. I was going to comment. Eric said something interesting that reminded me of something I thought about earlier. I think as we go through this process, it's really important to think about the cost and the burden that you're potentially putting on folks to participate in this, whether that's the providers, is the juice worth the squeeze for the providers to participate, but also for manufacturers. I know the HHS proposal was an interesting one, but as I read it, it would have been funded on the back of generic manufacturers who, last I checked, don't have a lot of free cash flow sitting around. And so, I just think it's really important that it's possible to overthink this and create something that is so complicated with so many compliance checks on everyone involved that no one plays.
So I think you make an important point that we often don't talk about because we don't want to sound like we're complaining, but that the burden factor is very real. And the reality is that if you look at the supply chain, not talking about the payment chain right now, just the supply chain, the markets are not what most people would think they are. So there isn't a lot of buffer in the system, which also means there isn't a lot of manpower that would be excess manpower to manage new programs, take on these new tools and the like. So we're thinking about how certain programs are shifting burden. I think we have to think about how we're managing burden, not just shifting it. So thinking about the provider level, I think it's really important to think about what it looks like to ask providers to take on more. Can we, instead of just having a buffer stop, can we have just a little bit more play, right? So when we're thinking about, okay, if your delivery doesn't come today, well, how many more days can you operate? Like, that's a different question about par levels and the like than having a whole buffer inventory. That may be more reasonable in terms of burden than standing up a buffer stock for an individual facility. But then there's also, and I think the actually the CMS buffer stock rule had to deal with this, the proposed rule had to deal with this a bit more. There's an equity question that we don't often talk through, which is the difference between the facilities that might be able to afford to do the stockpile or say we're gonna triple our par levels and the like, and the ones who are saying we're a rural hospital, we're just trying to do our best, and we're going to have to rely on the system to help us. So there's a lot of burden to go around, but as we're thinking about how we place those incentives, we really do have to center that equity question so that it's not just a matter of what you can afford, but also what makes sense based off of your need, your risk, and what you're able to handle downstream.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that even a little more on not just the, I do want to come back to the buffer stock point in a little bit. I know probably several of you have more to say on that, but around that kind of making a policy that works for, you know, a bigger system like Mayo Clinic, but also a smaller rural hospital. So many differences in terms of purchasing power and resources and staffing power available to deal with their purchasing decisions, managing inventory, all these things. Any recommendations on how to make a policy like this work a little better for all of those different players?
Yeah, I'll be glad to go first. I mean, I actually thought it was interesting when I read that that policy that they were limiting it to hospitals that are like 100 beds or less that are independent. And I thought to myself, like, how many of those are left anymore anyway? So
It's like 420.
yeah, I mean, so you're talking about a really tiny like group of hospitals. And I think the intent there was that they were trying to sort of raise those hospitals up because they don't have the wherewithal to sort of do what some of the other like large integrated delivery networks can do. But even at that level, I think it's just unrealistic. Like, I've worked in small hospitals like that, and I don't know that, again, like sort of the juice would be worth the squeeze. I would think about, you know, where you place the incentive as well in the whole distribution chain, because maybe the distributors are where, you know, they have the expertise and the capacity to like manage the inventory. Maybe an individual hospital can like sign up for a program that is run through someone like that. You know, those are the mechanisms I think we need to be thoughtful about, and then that could apply to other entities if you wanted to expand it out, something along those lines.
So this is a Nicolette perspective, not an HDA perspective.
Sure.
I actually think the idea of moving towards individual facility stockpiles is an incredibly dangerous one for the supply chain. And I think that's where we need to be careful, because the idea is if we just hold on to more stuff, we'll be ready for everything that happens. And then something happens and we don't have the stuff in the stockpile we need, and we've strained the supply chain in order to get to these 3-month stockpiles. And then we're left with what? So I fully take your point, Eric. I think one of the things that's interesting about how that proposal shook out and what I think the intent was in focusing on those facilities was thinking about the vulnerability of those facilities should there be an event. So I think the recognition that those facilities would have a unique vulnerability is valid and important, and we should uphold that when we're looking for policy solutions. I'm just not convinced that this is the policy solution.
Right.
But I also do agree with you that if we're thinking about how to manage burden,
If we have, for example, a regional stockpile that is of a limited amount of product that is able to be rotated, it does make sense for the distributor to do that and to hold that and to rotate that product on behalf of that region. But it does make sense to say that should be able to support a region, because when an event happens, when there is a surge, it's not clear that it's necessarily going to be that hospital or this pharmacy or the like that sees it. So we should be thinking more broadly so that we can have solutions that actually address the community and not just an individual facility.
Build on this because so again, everything that we know about supply chains goes exactly in the direction of, please do not. Do not do that at the hospital level, at the small hospital level, because we know that that alone can actually cause a shortage simply by trying to build up that buffer in a way that is uncoordinated and sudden. So definitely more at the regional level, definitely broader. And something that is usually omitted from the conversations around the buffer is, okay, so for how long? So you want to have a buffer for a month, 3 months, 6 months. What is that supposed to do? That you bought 6 months to do what exactly? If the average length of the stock out is 2 years. Because if we are imposing this type of capital expenditure burden just to feel better about ourselves, I mean, that doesn't do very much. If there is something a little bit more around, this is the way in which we coordinate it, and this is how we will spend those 6 months, that is something that we will understand a lot more. And this is probably where, as an innovator company, we probably also have more bandwidth to shoulder some of the stockpiles in a way that the generics would not.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, look, as you get into that, especially if you're talking about every hospital having their own, who knows how long, now you start to get into all sorts of funky contract questions. You know, how's that going to be rotated? Are they going to be able to return it? If so, at what price? Typically, contracts are at the price of selling that day. So is a generic manufacturer going to have to take a bath because someone did what HHS wanted them to do? Yeah, there's a lot that hasn't been teased out on this.
I want to touch on one more element of the Senate finance proposal and a lot of the other discussions in this area is around incentivizing domestic manufacturing is one potential element of reliability that gets discussed a lot in legislative proposals and other discussions. Just want to hear any thoughts from you on that front around in the Senate finance proposal, it was a small additional bonus payment for providers who buy from domestic manufacturers. We heard some other discussions earlier today about different ways to incentivize domestic manufacturing. We heard about the ASPR investments in API and KSMs for essential medicines being domestically manufactured. These different approaches and the advantages of domestic manufacturing, or how far can it go in terms of encouraging reliability?
You know, I'll just make a quick observation here. You use the word small, and I think that's one of the big problems here is we're really playing small ball with a lot of this stuff. When Arlene was talking earlier today, she said we spent almost $980 million, and I thought that's like, that used to be a lot of money like 20 years ago, but that's like 1% of what we have done for like student loans, or 2% of what we're doing for semiconductors. It's just for some aspect of the economy that saves so much money in healthcare. We're just so underinvesting in this area. It's probably a few $1 billion could make a huge difference. Now, not to be dismissive of like these small things, they can add up over time, but I just would love to see something bold, and something bold in the generic drug industry could be maybe like $5 billion would make huge differences, because I think the spend is like 100 billion a year, a little bit less than that.
Right. Yeah. No, that's exactly. I mean, look, I'm contractually bound to remind folks, generic spending is about 1.5% of all healthcare spending in the U.S. You can throw a lot of money at generics and still not feel that in the rest of the system. But I do want to comment on this question of onshoring and domestic manufacturing, and I think we would agree that as a goal, onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever shoring you wish to call it, is a laudable goal. But I also would remind folks that if we look at the 3 drug shortage drivers that got the most coverage last year. 2 of them involved production in the US. So last I checked, there's not a magic bubble that protects generics that are produced in the US. Doesn't protect them from bankruptcies, doesn't protect them from tornadoes, heck, doesn't protect them from having an inspection go poorly. And so again, I think if we end this conversation with a bunch of really cool, creative ideas on onshoring, and we haven't addressed the fundamental dynamics that are driving generic prices into the tank, then it's a failed process.
Just to,
Go ahead.
just to double down on the concern about onshoring. Geographical diversity should continue to be the goal. There are more national security interests that would be served by these domestic manufacturing proposals than drug shortage instance. So, and we should just be honest about that because that is important. So it is fine to say that strategically, there are certain products for which, antibiotics is one example, we are too concentrated in a particular market that's also geopolitical concern. And for that reason, increased focus on diversification, incredibly important. But that's not the same as saying that diversification, or rather concentration, is going to solve drug shortages. And I just think there's both a nuance there and there's a way that we need to be careful for exactly the reasons that Craig just highlighted. Moving things to the US does not prevent them from having the same type of production and reliability issues. And we could actually harm ourselves by also not having access to the production that is happening overseas.
And just building on that, I think that this conversation gets caught up in issues of national security, not just here, but in many of the countries where we operate, very clearly. And that is primarily bound to concentration of a particular step of supply for particular products in a particular country that is considered to be sensitive at the moment. David had made the point that a company like Novartis is not going to do all of our manufacturing in the US. We have a lot of manufacturing in Europe. We still have shortages in Europe. We know that is not the solution. The solution is, and we have known this in terms of supply chain for many, many years, having a broad-based, diversified sourcing, dual sourcing by design, and yes, recognizing that national security concerns are relevant. Healthcare, biotechnology is not a dual-use technology. It has defensive qualities, it's very clear. But it's important not to confuse the two debates and be very clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve.
And building on that, I mean, look, I think we have to recognize there are policies in place that perpetuate shortages. There was a time, when a shortage would be underway or maybe looming, and FDA would reach out to Novartis, back to Generics, one of our other member companies, and say, hey, we know you have an ANDA for this. Can you get back into this market? And there was a time where the answer was yes, was usually yes. Today, that answer is usually no, because they just can't, whether that's because of the inflation penalties they're going to incur, whether that's because there's zero predictability that by the time they re-ramp up, that they're going to have sales, whether that's, I have a member who tells us a story. They have a product that is in high demand at a certain time of the year and has been in shortage, and their cost of goods are $2, and they can only sell it in the US for 60 cents. Guess where it's being sold? Not here, right? So like, there are these things that used to work, but now because of policies that are in place that Congress, that the various agencies have well intended, but not thought through, no longer work.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what Nicolette told us at the beginning, to be very careful about what we're trying to incentivize and how. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'm going to hand it over to Garrett Homry, our Senior Research Director here at the Duke-Margolis Institute. And I'll thank this panel for all of their remarks. And our next one.
Comments and other participants in panel 3, thank you so much. How about now? Perfect. Fourth and final panel for the day. This one's really going to focus on advanced manufacturing and where that may enable and contribute to reliability. As we tee this up, listen, I don't think anybody on this panel or at Duke-Margolis or at the Consortium is under the belief that singularly something like advanced manufacturing could solve things like drug shortages and these chronic issues that we have. So we'll certainly dispel that myth, but we do hope that that's part of the conversation. With folks here, each of you are going to have a pretty phenomenal bit of experience with some interesting advanced manufacturing capabilities, and certainly look forward to hearing about those, both in the context of drug shortages and frankly beyond it. One of the things that we talk about at the Consortium, won't it be wonderful when instead of 95% of our work being drug shortages focused, it might be 75%, and then 50%, and 35%. At that point in time, hopefully we might have full days that are related to advanced manufacturing, et cetera. So know that we certainly recognize and look forward to this conversation extending beyond just the troubling drug shortages realities. The other component of this is really how federal policy might contribute to the adoption of advanced manufacturing technologies, and certainly look forward to your input there. Our esteemed guests for today are Andy Carpenter, executive. Actually, let me do this in order to make it easier for folks online. Joel Welch, Assistant Director for Science and Biosimilar Strategy at FDA. Darren McCann, Director of Government and External Affairs at the API Innovation Center. Andy, third down the row, Andy Carpenter, Executive Vice President of Manufacturing, Science and Technology at Flow. And then at the end is Mark Godfrey, Senior Director of Global Public Policy at Eli Lilly. As we start things off, maybe I'll just go ahead and go in order again. If you each don't mind introducing yourself and just talking a bit about your organization and what role you've had in advanced manufacturing to get things started.
All right, good afternoon. I'll let you figure it out. Good afternoon, Joel Welch. I work at FDA in Cedar in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality and the Office of Product Quality Assessment 3. I'm the Associate Director for Science and Biosimilar Strategy. I spend most of my day dealing with assessment issues. Our office deals with manufacturing quality for biologics in Cedar, as well as small molecule APIs. I wear another hat, which is the chair of the emerging technology team. And that is a Cedar program, some 10 years old, that supports the development of advanced manufacturing and innovation for a variety of product types in Cedar. It's less one engagement with companies and more a series of engagements that begins at the inception of a program's development, even before in some cases a molecule has even been identified. And then as a consequence, we de-risk and front load a lot of the regulatory discussions and hopefully address roadblocks, technical challenges as they emerge, so that once technology gets ready to be submitted in a dossier, it's able to seamlessly be introduced, and a lot of the hard conversations have already been had and addressed. As a consequence of my role in ETT, we also get to play in some other interesting areas in terms of supporting innovative research that happens in the center as well. Many of our research portfolio programs are devoted to advanced manufacturing. It's an important topic, as you can imagine. And then helping to support other initiatives such as policy development, such as our FRAME initiative, the Framework for Advanced Manufacturing Evaluation, which is pressure testing many of the technologies that we see coming in the next 5 to 10 years, like distributed manufacturing, point-of-care manufacturing, and then continuous manufacturing, AI and machine learning. So really helping to identify where our policy gaps and needs are and positioning those technologies for success. So always exciting to talk advanced manufacturing and excited to be here. So thank you for the chance.
Thank you so much for making it. Darren, how about you?
And I'm pretty loud, so, again, my name is Gary McCam, with the API Innovation Center, which, is a pretty new organization, established a little over 2 years ago as a nonprofit. And our goal is to be pharmaceutical kind of innovators. And so we have a public-private partnership. We're a nonprofit. We partner with the state of Missouri. And the idea there was understanding that in Missouri, we had a unique combination of manufacturers, high-quality universities, and if we would just invest in some of these advanced manufacturing technologies, let's just try it out. Let's just see what happens. And so we did that. And so right now we are working with a drug, and I can talk a bit more later, but a drug named Lomasteen that we're using continuous flow technology to develop. That we are be able to reduce the cost and be the ones to first onshore this drug that's been offshore for a considerable amount of years in India. And so our goal and mission is not to make a profit at the end of the day. We want to keep the doors open, but not necessarily make dividends, but really to address the national health security crisis by going after pharmaceuticals that we feel are best suited for advanced manufacturing technology, and then investing. One last thing that we also do is we ourselves are not a manufacturer. So we are an investor. And so we will go to the university that's specializing in continuous flow and say, I want you to do the rapid synthesis work for this API. Once that's done, we pick it up and we drop into the manufacturer site. Then we say, okay, these are the advanced manufacturing technologies and equipment that you need. We're going to invest in that and drop it in your site, in your idle capacity. Take it from there. And we just bring it down to the supply line. And so that's our mission. That's our goal. That's what we wake up every day looking to do. And happy to speak more as time allows.
Wonderful. Garen, thank you. Andy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Andy Carpenter. First of all, on behalf of Flow, we're very appreciative to be part of this conversation. It's great to have both policy, industry, trade organizations, a lot of people having this conversation because this is how we solve problems. But I'm also humbled to be here today with this distinguished group of folks talking about advanced technologies. So just by way of background, so Flow is a trailblazing essential medicine impact company that is dedicated to coming up with solutions to the essential medicine supply chain problem. And we do that by, at least one of the ways, establishing an end-to-end development and manufacturing capability in the US using advanced technologies. You probably have guessed by the name of our company that we do like flow chemistry. It's not all we do, but it's certainly something that I personally am invested in. And I think, as we'll hear from Garen as well, we have used flow to really try to attack problems for a manufacturing problem so that we can reduce cost, we can ensure quality or reliability of quality, help with reducing waste because we don't like the environmental impact that a lot of the processes that are out there have on the environment. We think we can do better. And it's funny to be in the last panel because there's been so many great opening remarks, and really I feel like I can't say any more than most of the people who have already been up here, because I think we're all generally speaking the same language and singing the same tune. But I will certainly add that partnerships, collaborations, cooperations, that's been a theme throughout, of course, right? So that's something that Flow personally benefits from. So we're part of a public-private partnership. We've been funded by both BARDA and ASPR to bring manufacturing of essential medicines back to the United States. So of the 86, that Arlene mentioned. We're of course working on several of those, but that has to continue. There has to be some way to change the economics of the problem. You know, we're blessed by that, but we think that needs to continue and really expand. I'll also say that Arlene mentioned it, and we heard it several times, funding is an issue. And the drop in the bucket of what, the $900 and something million is relatively small, right? We think that should be increased funding for all sorts of projects, public-private partnerships, potentially incentives, and specifically for ASPR, who plays a critical role. Their funding is not, I'm going to say very straightforward, or we have an understanding of what the future holds, which means that then partnerships that they are funding, those industrial partners like ourselves, we have problems or issues with that reliability or predictability of the funding. So it's hard for us to invest in the right things. So we really would love to see, you know, that predictability and reliability of the funding exist. And I know that we're going to get to some questions about advanced manufacturing technologies. I'm a chemist, so that's really where I'd like to spend most of my time.
Noted. I did flag coming back to complicated and uncertain funding future, but I'll bypass you when we come to that one if you'd like. Mark, round us out.
Sure, I could echo Andrew and say that I could probably cobble my remarks together by saying I echo what this person, that person, and that other person said earlier. So I'll just go from there though. So I'm Mark Godfrey. I'm with Eli Lilly and Company. We're a global biopharmaceutical company based in the Midwest in Indianapolis, Indiana. We've been in the business of making medicines for about 150 years almost. And we are actually all in on U.S. manufacturing of late. And since 2020, we've committed to investing about $18 billion in shoring up our manufacturing facilities. The lion's share, about 9 of those, are in our home state of Indiana, with 2 new facilities, one which will do API and one will do gene therapies. So we'll have some brand new operations there with significant resources behind that, employing upwards of 700 people. We also have 2 facilities that we're putting in North Carolina, in Concord and the Research Triangle. And then we've recently acquired a facility for biomanufacturing in Wisconsin. So again, we are all in, but I also want to echo that we are a global company. And so we've also made recent investments in Ireland with new facilities, as well as in Germany. And we do think it's a global network of supply chain. So some of my other comments will reflect that, but I can share more on some of those thoughts later.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mark. Before we go into some of those more interesting kind of advanced technologies, et cetera, could each of you, and maybe I'll bypass you, Joel, on this one, but on the manufacturing side of things, could the 3 of you each speak to some of the additional things that are hampering adoption? I mean, we talk so much about this not being a technology problem, and yes, there's, you know, complicated and uncertain funding futures, and we've got, you know, reimbursement challenges, et cetera. But can you talk about some of the other things that are hampering adoption of more advanced manufacturing technologies?
Yeah, sure. We've already talked about today. We talk about I call it kind of the iceberg. You see the top of the iceberg. We see drug shortages at the highest time it's ever been. We know that 84% of the top 100 generics have no U.S. source for API. But when we take a step back and say, what are kind of the driving costs of that and driving implications? I know my friends Betsy at USP and Company, they came up with a study that essentially pharmaceutical discontinuations between 2022 and 2023 went up by 40%. 40% in that small window of time. The biggest thing is we have idle capacity around the United States where we have, you know, 30% of manufacturing industries, they have 50% idle capacity or more idle capacity. The biggest thing is economics. I mean, we've heard it today. It's the economics of working in the generic space. So if you go to a manufacturer and you ask them to, why don't you start a new line of an API, they're going to look at you and go, okay, so we have the commoditization kind of effect where all the brands have become generics, and then there's a race to the bottom to make it as cheap as possible. And then once it gets to that bottom level, it's become, but where the return on investment is so minuscule that you're just trying to keep the doors open. And so with that understanding in mind, you can't ask a generic manufacturer, why don't you spend, 4 or 5 million in continuous flow manufacturing technology? Where's that going to come from? And so once we address the economics of the situation, we can start to have that next conversation, especially when it comes to investment in the manufacturers. And then the last thing I'll mention is really kind of the foreign competition perspective. I mean, we're going against China, India, Taiwan, those who are actually, they have incentives for actually producing APIs in their countries. We don't have those same type of structures here in the United States. And so you're going against countries that have less environmental regulations, less labor costs. And so all those compounding all keeps the manufacturer from saying, I'm just trying to run my lines and keep up. And so I think those all those calculations go into that hampering effect.
Andy? Yeah. I don't think there's a lack of appetite for advanced manufacturing. And I think a great example is, the FDA really promoting using continuous processing for manufacturing and even providing support in the emerging technology program. We've got Joel here, it's fantastic. But I think there's likely a risk-averse attitude within the pharmaceutical industry. It's highly regulated. A lot of existing manufacturing plants, right? It's very costly to upgrade to a new technology. And if the margins are not there in the generic space, why would you? I see a need that even my personal experience as a chemist, I was never trained in continuous manufacturing. I was trained in batch. I can pull, everyone knows what a round bottom flask is. You can pull a round bottom flask off and you can do a reaction, right? But as a chemist, I didn't have the ability to pull a flow reactor off the shelf and do reactions. Now we're starting to get there. So there's definitely a transition within, say, the educational systems, right, to start to teach more of this, but it's still not very prevalent, right? We're fortunate in the Richmond, Petersburg corridor that we actually have a new program. It's a joint program between VCU and VSU and other local universities where they have a degree where they actually are teaching continuous processing or flow chemistry, right? So we're starting to build up a workforce because then you can pull those people within your regions or just within somewhere into your industry to help, and they understand how to do a technology like flow chemistry. There are issues with standardization of equipment. If you're going to take one flow system from one vendor, you can't really hook that up to another system from another vendor because they don't really talk to each other. Now, again, standardization would be a great thing. It's harder to do within the industry. I think there are ways around that. There's some small changes, but there's just multiple barriers to adopting a new technology. And unfortunately, in the generic space, at least where we're working, we have to get as much non-value add out of the process as we can. Right, so we have to use every possible technology. So continuous flow, Joel mentioned AI or machine learning, certainly things that we're delving into, automation, just different innovative business processes to help. There's a lot that we can bring to bear, but there certainly are many barriers to bring advanced technologies forward. I think we're starting to move in the right direction, but it's still going to be a long way.
Appreciate that. Mark, anything to add there?
Yeah, just add on, I mean, I won't beat the drum of economics anymore. I think anybody who's been halfway awake in the last 3 hours has heard about that. So I think that's covered, and we would agree with that. And I think it's a little bit easier on the innovator side of the industry to put, capital behind these kinds of projects. But when, generic companies are facing the pressures that they do, it makes it much more difficult. And I think I heard a comment earlier today in some earlier meetings about, small biotechs maybe, be challenged for that as well. So it's not just the generic industry, it's everyone. And I would just add a couple comments as well, that on the global side, it's one thing to get the advanced manufacturing approved here. But once we get through FDA, we have to go and get approved elsewhere in the world because we're selling into global markets. And so you have that time pressure as well, that it's a constraint for everybody involved. And then the other one is skills gap. I think, we have, as I mentioned with our recent investments, we're going to have a lot of staffing needs, and we need STEM degrees. We need people with advanced degrees in chemistry and biomanufacturing. You name it. It's going to require some really, people with engineering degrees in robotics and who can use these new technologies. And so that's a skills gap that we're trying to fill by working with some local universities at Purdue University and Ivy Tech Community College. We're doing scholarships to help to get people with those degrees so they can join that workforce. So that would just add the workforce barrier. And then I think on the regulatory side as well, and I don't know if you see this at FDA, but regulators are going to have to keep up with the technology also. And so there's a skills capability development need there as well, as so they're able to review the products and do it in a timely way.
Super helpful on all aspects. Also, if we don't get back to the education workforce component today, that's something that comes up a decent amount. I certainly would like to get back to in the future. Joel, I think you were going to.
Can I come in real quick?
Yeah.
I liked a lot of what I heard. Obviously, economics, right? We're all, I think, aligned that that's really the big driver. The flip side to me is, regulatory doesn't seem like a big barrier. A decade of data from the Emerging Technology Program shows, actions are not delayed, CRs don't occur because of the introduction of advanced manufacturing. So I think we're optimistic that that's not a real, concern. And to the extent that, harmonization globally is a challenge, I think there's always more we can do in that space, but we do have opportunities, parallel scientific advice. There's what's called the Quality Innovation Group in Europe, and we have met jointly with companies with that entity as well. So there's opportunities to engage globally. I wanted to highlight the standardization piece, because I think that's one that's really under discussed. Having been on some site visits with ETT and seeing innovative technologies we had engaged on, technologies we had represented on a PowerPoint slide with a little cartoon, and then hearing about all the different individual welds and configurations to actually introduce it, make it work, and how to talk to a control system, and then make a bespoke batch record to describe it. There's a lot of opportunity there to have industry, I think, collaborate and lower the activation energy for everyone for that type of technology.
Thank you for that. I'll stick with the standardization piece and combine it with something else, the dry topic of definitions. So introduce a couple things, and then guys jump in where you want. So speaking of, say, FDA programs, ETP, CAT, or Advanced Manufacturing Technologies Designation Program, you hear a lot when it comes to advanced manufacturing about novel or innovative. One of the things, and it makes a lot of sense, a lot of really incredible, sophisticated stuff going on here. You guys could talk about it all day long. So either sticking with that component and talking a little bit more about the standardization piece, and or something we've talked about a decent amount at Duke-Margolis. We talked about it today at a meeting before the meeting started, before this event started. We've increasingly started to talk about not just advanced manufacturing, but discerning advanced manufacturing from modernization. And maybe advanced manufacturing, you've got all sorts of sophisticated, interesting technologies that might be more kind of brand focused, more innovative, more originator product focused. Maybe in the generic space, it might be more about modernization, auto visualization versus manual, certain novel container closures, things that you wouldn't necessarily think of at this day and age as being advanced manufacturing. So either, jumping in on the standardization piece and taking that further, or if we want to try and incorporate some of the drug shortages issues, might there be a role for discerning between, say, advanced manufacturing and modernization, and maybe some of these modernization ideas might be more frankly necessary and based on the economics, the only capable option for generics? Anybody want to jump in on either of those themes? Give options, let's go around.
Yes.
We'll be here all day.
Yeah, totally.
Mark, you start.
Totally agree that it would be helpful to have that distinction between modernization and the really more advanced, novel, innovative kind of technologies. I think, we do need to distinguish because not everybody's going to adopt all of these brand new shiny things immediately. And there's a lot of good that can be done by just modernizing our facilities. And that's stands, I think, for generic or innovator sides.
Yeah, I mean, you can have, advanced batching processing. Again, continuous flow, I mean, it's not quote unquote novel. It's been around in other industries. It just hasn't taken off as much in the pharmaceutical space. And so when it comes to generic manufacturers, that may make the most sense that marginal improvement may be their version of advanced manufacturing. And we need to be able to accept that. When it comes to our thought and how we've used continuous flow technology with, like I mentioned before, Lomasteen, we know continuous flow won't be able to fix everything, but so we look at the multiple steps it takes to actually develop it. Two-step process. We can use that for continuous flow. We can address that, but if you go to 3 steps, the more complex, it's going to become more difficult. So you may have to look into the more advanced AI type, virtual type of digital twin type opportunities to kind of test the waters a bit. But yeah, to that point, I think some improvement would be in the generic space. It's just a good thing in the right direction.
Joel, any thoughts on how the agency might manage something like that? I mean, you talk about your more advanced technologies and there were a lot of head nods related to, sounds like successful interactions from folks related to introducing advanced manufacturing and having good engagement with the FDA. But to that more, I don't know, lower bar, second tier modernization that might have a greater impact on generics. Any thoughts there or outside of your wheelhouse?
I think there's a couple important, considerations here. One, obviously, advanced, manufacturing offers tremendous potential and upside, but modernization does too, right? There's plenty of technologies that if they were more widely used, I think it would be a good thing. As we think about the technology's life cycle, there's this part of the emerging technology program where a novel advanced manufacturing technology graduates out of it, where it becomes mature enough, it's not really required to have that ETT engagement and there's training of assessment staff. I think there's probably another step in that technology's life cycle of it may be no longer being advanced manufacturing and becoming baseline. I don't know what the right term is. There's probably more elegant one than that, but there's probably that next step. And I think, when you look at the Advanced Manufacturing Technology Designation Program, the criteria are not just novelty, right? There's got to be some impact on the development timeline. There's questions, how does it impact the overall quality or it's, the robustness of a supply. So I think if you want to say, how do we think about modernization? I think you need to think about some of those same type of considerations, understanding the technology's role in the overall product, because advanced manufacturing is sometimes conflated with continuous manufacturing, right? Continuous is a type of advanced manufacturing, and modernization, I think, would be the same kind of menagerie of different things, and you need to make sure we're prioritizing the right ones that really offer value and acknowledging that the modernization may not be one technology, it may be a series of technologies. So spending the time and effort on the right one, I think, would be important.
Just a couple more for the group here, wanting to finish on time. One, we talked in the previous session about domestic manufacturing and similar to advanced manufacturing. There's not going to be some panacea there, but Darren, Andy, Mark, all of you have significant domestic production. One of the things that we were curious about is whether advanced manufacturing technologies, of which you are all quite familiar with within your organizations, is that a differentiator for you guys with your domestic production? Is there Are the lessons to learn there?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and say that, in many ways, it's not that you have to completely onshore everything, but doggone, you gotta have some control of your supply chain. Right, and so if you're gonna be distributing medicines to patients in the United States, wouldn't you think that you would have the ability to make the drug product in the United States and also the API, drug substance in the United States, and even some key intermediates? It might also be nice at times to have the ability to make the key starting materials. We have an example for a project that we're starting that the key starting material is not available in the United States, but we're looking at an alternative advanced technology, fermentation, right, to provide that key starting material. And the goal is then that technology can be brought to the United States. So that overcomes that hurdle for us. So I do believe having domestic manufacturing is important. And if we are going to manufacture in the United States, then you certainly want to try to squeeze out all of the inefficiencies that you have, or else you just can't be competitive if you're in the generic space.
I mean, for us, we saw the ability to ensure quality in a certain way. So basically, in the end product, when we had 3 batches that we were testing, we had 99% purity when developing like Lomastain. And long term, the idea is we'll take that approach. We just signed a contract to develop 2 more new molecules for one of the largest healthcare systems in the Midwest. And the idea is can we condense processing time as well? And so all these different things you hear about the advantages of advanced technology and what we could do with it, we're now trying to explore. Again, we've seen it in the immediate. Now, as we grow and as we see what different molecules that we're going to address, what barriers they may come up, and you don't know until you get into the lab what you're going to face. But those are kind of the 2 major things that we've seen in the immediate, and hopefully we'll see some more benefits moving forward.
Anything from you, Mark?
Yeah, I can just add, we've had some luck with continuous manufacturing, and we've seen benefit there. Keeping the process all in that closed loop gives some efficiencies. It's, to boil it down without going into too much detail, I think it offers that flexibility and adaptability that all adds up to resilience. And I think, we've seen that it can be faster, it can be scalable, and it can be greener. So all those things are pretty useful. And I think, from a quality standpoint, you keep in that integrated system, you keep all that data in one place. So it's good for data analytics and process oversight and monitoring. So those kinds of benefits are also useful and efficient. So I think you'll see more and more adoption of these technologies as we move forward.
Well, since the Senate Finance bill has been quite the story for the day, and leading into the day, I suppose I must incorporate one to this panel as well. And I'll ask the question, accepting all the caveats that were mentioned earlier about overly simplistic use of terminology, but the devil's in the details, right? How are you going to apply this? What are potential negative externalities, et cetera? Certainly appreciate that. That being said, there is currently a Medicare bonus payment for buying from manufacturers using advanced manufacturing capabilities. Any thoughts on whether you've got some capability there to provide helpful incentives to manufacturers like yourselves? Is another one where I'll bypass Joel, but he might surprise me at the end. As one component. We've certainly talked about with Flow and Karen with API Innovation Center, your kind of supply side, access to great supply side incentives. But any thoughts at this point in time, whether from you or from colleagues, about whether that Medicare bonus payment might serve as an effective incentive, noting all the caveats we mentioned before?
Yeah, I'm going to try not to repeat what others have said. So I'll say it's a step in the right direction, of course. But the one thing that I really want us to kind of drill home is that we need to really address direct grants and opportunities to manufacturers, not have it trickle down direct to the manufacturers, because we're making, as I said before, we're making a lot of assumptions that it will get to the manufacturers at the end of the day. I would also say that within the proposal, I'm actually very curious to see what the public-private partnership is going to look like. Basically, are you going to come up with a list of drugs that you actually care about, and then you're going to go through that list, or are you going to set certain quality measures that all manufacturers have to adhere to in order to participate in that program and make it standardized where you can actually test and see if they're meeting all requirements? Guaranteed contracts where, there's guaranteed volumes at the end of the day that are consistent. So I think that feedback from that public-private partnership is one of the most intriguing parts of it, and one of the biggest and greatest opportunities we have within that legislation.
Anything from you gentlemen down the road?
I think I'll say it's too early to tell for me personally. If my colleague Val were here, she might have more to say about it, but I think I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, our initial look at the incentive finance package is that, those are the kinds of carrots that we feel will help move the needle a little bit. I think we're hoping that, a few people have said, it's not one answer to this stuff. There's a lot of things that are going to add up, and I think we feel like it has the potential to contribute to maybe changing some procurement behaviors, and which could help. And whether or not it gives enough to drive investment in advanced manufacturing, I couldn't say. I think, it's probably falls a little bit short of that, but more options, more incentives can be made.
Well, listen, with that, we're just about on time. I'm a bit of a stickler in that regard in general, but also quite respectful to everybody that's been participating today, including yourselves. We can give them a round of applause here. And bring it back.
Great. Thank you, Garrett, and to all the panelists. So this is when I usually would provide a summary of all the different panels in great detail, but it is 5 o'clock and there's a reception outside. So instead, I will stop. I will just say that the discussions we've heard today have given us a lot to think about, and it's going to inform our continued work. And we really think it's going to have a great impact on what we're trying to do to prevent drug shortages and promote drug supply chain reliability. So we hope that you all found it informative as well. I'm going to keep this really brief. I just want to do some thank yous. So a big thank you to our consortium members and our government observers for valuable contribution. We know you give a lot of your time and your thoughts, and we ask you to do a lot of work for us. So we really appreciate all that you've done. And just in the last year and a half that this consortium has been in existence, we're really lucky. We know that, to have such a dedicated and experienced group of experts. And so we really appreciate all that you give to this consortium. Again, if you're interested and you're not part of the consortium and you would like to learn more, please provide us you can find our contact information on the Duke-Margolis website. You can talk to any of the staff that are here, and we're happy to provide that information, and also to show you the ways that you can read some of our past publications and see some of our other efforts. I'd also like to thank our team here at Duke-Margolis who helped make this event. So I'm going to start with our operations and marketing team and office management staff. So that's Luke, if he's here anymore, but Luke DeRocher, we got Hannah Vitelio, Rahel Petros, and Eric Shipley. And then I want to just thank our supply chain team. This is pretty nice. A year and a half in, when it was originally just Stephen Thomas and me coming up with some ideas on the back of a piece of paper. So not too shabby to be able to bring such an esteemed group to this room. Really, and all of you that have joined us virtually. I'm just really, really proud of this group. So thank you to Stephen Colville, Thomas Rhodes, Garrett Homre, Grace Hoover, Cameron Joyce, and Catherine Hamilton. So with with that, enjoy the reception and thank you all so much for giving us your time today.